I've always loved the mountains. The calm, the quiet, the raw beauty. It has a way of drawing you in, making you feel small, but in a peaceful, grounding way. There's something about the high places, the rugged terrain, that gives you a sense of control over your own life. It's why I ended up with a gold claim, deep in the mountains of Northern California, with a buddy of mine, Frank. Frank was a few years older than me, well into his 50s, and an old-timer who had been mining in these mountains for decades. He knew the land like the back of his hand. But the gold claim wasn't just about digging for gold. It was about getting out there, away from the world, where it was just you and the wilderness. One early spring day, we decided to hike up the river. The winter had been harsh, and we wanted to see if any changes had come about. Rivers sometimes shifted, new paths formed, and sometimes you could stumble upon a new deposit of gold hidden under a fresh wash of gravel. We set off with our 2 dogs, an older retriever named Max and my German Shepherd, Duke. Both of the dogs had been on countless hikes with us, and they were as familiar with the terrain as we were. The trail we took ran along the riverbed, winding through the dense underbrush and past steep cliffs. Frank was the kind of guy who liked to take his time, soak in the surroundings, especially on days like this when the sun broke through the canopy and the air felt fresh with the scent of pine. After a good while, we came across a large log fallen across the trail, and Frank decided to take a rest. "Sit down for a minute, partner," he said. "Give the dogs a break." I nodded, and we both sat down, our backs against the cool log. The river gurgled below us, and the birds sang from the treetops. It was peaceful. For a moment, I didn't think about the risks of the mountains, the bears, the mountain lions, or anything else. It was just the sound of the forest and the warmth of the sun on my face. As we sat there, Frank lit a cigarette, and I leaned back, closing my eyes for a minute. The dogs wandered around, sniffing the ground. Then, out of nowhere, Max, the older retriever, started whining. It was strange, not like him to get so worked up. He darted over and hid under Frank's legs, looking back towards the trees as if something had spooked him. Duke, my German Shepherd, was a different story. He stood up abruptly, his body tense, ears pricked, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. He wasn't looking at us. His eyes were locked on the steep hillside behind us, towards the ridge about 15 feet up. "That's not a good sign," I joked, but even as I said it, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I turned to look behind us, just as the low growl from Duke continued. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement caught my eye. A large, dark shape crouching at the edge of the underbrush, just below the ridge. Its eyes glinted from the shadows, focused on us, and I froze. A mountain lion. The huge feline was crouched, muscles taut, ready to spring. Its golden fur blended with the dry foliage, but those eyes, those predatory eyes, stuck out like a beacon in the dim light. It only took a split second for my mind to process everything. Frank wasn't moving. He was still sitting there, puffing on his cigarette, completely unaware. But the dogs, thank God for the dogs, had sensed it before I did. They were both on high alert, and if we hadn't noticed, that cat might have pounced. I grabbed for my pistol, which I always carried when we were out here. The weight of it felt heavy in my hand as I pulled it free from its holster. I stood up, shouting as I did, trying to make myself appear bigger, louder, anything to intimidate the beast. The last thing I wanted was to have to shoot, but I knew if I didn't act quickly, we could be in serious trouble. The lion, startled by my yell and the sound of the rustling dogs, seemed to reconsider. It hesitated for a moment, perhaps weighing its options. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it bolted up the slope, disappearing into the thick trees above. I don't think I've ever been that relieved. Frank finally stood up, still holding his cigarette, looking at me as if I had lost my mind. "You see something?" he asked, completely calm, his tone like nothing had happened. "Yeah," I said, still watching the tree lean where the mountain lion had disappeared. "Big cat, real close." Frank didn't seem too concerned. He'd been around these parts for years and had heard plenty of stories of mountain lions, bears, and other wild creatures, but he'd never had a close encounter like that one. "Good thing we had the dogs," I said, my voice still shaky. If they hadn't noticed it. They're good dogs, Frank agreed, crouching down to pet Max. They're always on the lookout for us. We both knew that mountain lions were around here. We had seen tracks, heard howls in the distance at night, and the occasional warning from other miners about sightings. But we had never encountered one so close, especially not one that was sizing us up as prey. I stayed quiet for a few minutes, still scanning the trees. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and I felt my heart racing. But as the seconds passed, I began to calm down, the tension slowly fading. We didn't talk much after that. We decided to head back down the trail, keeping our eyes peeled for any other signs of wildlife. The dogs were on edge, walking a little closer to us than usual. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but the encounter had left an impression on me. When we got back to camp, I double-checked the rifles and pistols, making sure everything was in working order. From that day forward, I never went up into those mountains without a firearm. The terrain was rough, the wilderness unforgiving, and a single mistake could cost you your life. We were at least 15 miles from the nearest paved road and another 30 miles from any real civilization. If something happened out there, you were on your own. That mountain lion had been a reminder of how small we really were, how much danger lurked just beyond the trail. There was no room for complacency in the wild. From then on, I always carried a gun, and I never took the dogs or Frank for granted again. I'm not sure if I ever saw that mountain lion again, but the memory of it and the closeness of the encounter will stay with me forever. The wilderness is beautiful, but it demands respect, and sometimes respect comes with a heavy dose of fear. I was 12 years old the first time I went deep into the Minnesota wilderness. It was the summer of 1996, and my older cousin Tyler had invited me to go camping and hiking with him and his dad for a week up in the northern part of the state. We were headed to the Superior National Forest, near the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. I didn't know what that meant back then, just that it was supposed to be real wild country. No roads, no cell service, and more trees and water than I could ever imagine. We drove up from central Minnesota past Duluth, winding through smaller and smaller towns until it was just forest on all sides. It was about a 5-hour drive, and by the time we parked at the edge of a gravel road and started unloading our gear, it felt like we had left civilization behind. Tyler was 16, already over 6 feet tall and a bit of a show-off, but he was good to me. His dad, my Uncle Joe, was a quiet man who had grown up fishing and hunting in the North Woods. He didn't talk much, but he knew the land. I think my parents felt better sending me out with him than they would have with anyone else. We had backpacks stuffed with supplies, a heavy canvas tent, fishing poles, and a big cooler of food that we were going to stash in a tree once we got to camp. Joe handed us each a paddle and pointed to a narrow aluminum canoe. We were going in deep by water. We paddled for what felt like hours. The air smelled like pine needles and the water was so clear you could see right to the bottom. We passed loons that let out eerie calls, and every now and then a fish would splash near the surface. I'd never felt so far away from home before. There weren't any houses, no other boats, just trees, water, and sky. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to, almost too quiet. We set up camp at the edge of a small, tree-lined lake. It didn't even have a name on the map Joe showed us, just a little blue oval with no roads near it. I helped Tyler collect firewood while Joe set up the tent and hung the food cooler high in a tree. Everything had to be kept away from bears. That's all I kept hearing about. Bears, bears, bears. I was more nervous about that than anything else. Joe told us not to worry, that the real key was not to leave any food out or wrappers lying around. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder every time I walked off to pee. That first night around the campfire, it was peaceful. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, told stories, and stared up at the stars, which looked way brighter than they did back home. I crawled into my sleeping bag that night thinking I might actually enjoy this trip. The second night is when things got weird. It was just past 3 in the morning when I woke up to a noise that I'll never forget. It was a sharp, echoing slap, followed by a huge splash of water, loud enough to wake all 3 of us up instantly. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering in my chest. It sounded like someone had chucked a huge boulder into the lake or fired a gun. My first thought was that there was someone out there, some stranger, maybe a hunter or another camper, even though we hadn't seen a single soul in 2 full days. Joe had said this area was rarely visited, but something had made that sound. Tyler whispered something like, "What the hell was that?" And Joe unzipped the tent slowly and leaned his head out. It was pitch dark outside. We hadn't left the fire going, so the only light was from the moon, and even that was mostly hidden behind clouds. I could hear the water lapping softly at the shore, and then again, smack. Another massive crack echoed across the lake, followed by a splash. I jumped so hard I nearly hit the roof of the tent. It sounded like someone was out there, beating the water with a giant club. Joe quietly slipped out of the tent, and I stayed frozen inside with Tyler. I didn't even want to breathe too loud. I remember the way my fingers felt cold and numb, even though it wasn't that chilly out. My mind kept going back and forth. Was it a gunshot? A thrown rock? What would even make that kind of sound? Joe came back after a few minutes and told us to stay calm. He said he didn't see anyone, but that he'd heard the splash, too. Told us to stay in the tent and go back to sleep. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, in daylight, the lake looked peaceful and calm, almost like it had been mocking us all night. Joe walked down to the water's edge and pointed out something. Flat, wide drag marks on the muddy bank near the edge. He said it was a beaver. I didn't believe him at first. That loud slap noise? That was a beaver? Turns out when beavers get scared, they slap their tails, big, wide, flat tails, against the surface of the water before they dive under. It's their way of warning other beavers. And let me tell you, it's like a whip crack across the stillness of a northern lake at night. I'd never heard anything like it. Sounded way too big to be an animal, but it was. Later that day, we even saw one across the lake, swimming with just its head above water. Joe pointed it out. "That's your guy," he said. Tyler laughed, but I didn't. Still felt weird to me. I kept thinking about how loud it had been and how easily I'd thought it was a person with bad intentions. We spent the rest of the day fishing and hiking around the lake. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was stupid, I knew. I kept telling myself that. But still, I kept checking over my shoulder, especially when I went to pee or wandered off the trail even a little. I didn't like the idea of someone or something being close by and making noise in the night. 2 nights later, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't on the water. It was a rustling sound, soft at first, then louder. Something moving through our camp. It was around midnight, maybe later. We'd gone to sleep early that night. I had finally managed to relax a little, and I remember dreaming about something dumb, like school or playing Nintendo with my friends. Then I heard it. Asterisk, asterisk, crunch, crunch, shuffle, asterisk, asterisk. Leaves and twigs. Something moving around right outside the tent. I froze again, just like I had during the beaver thing. Tyler was already awake, staring at the roof of the tent. Joe sat up and held a finger to his lips. He unzipped the tent just a few inches and peered out. There were no footsteps, no voices, just slow, steady rustling, like something sniffing around the fire pit or digging at the edge of the gear pile. For a second, I thought, asterisk, asterisk, bear, asterisk, asterisk. My stomach flipped. All the warnings, all the keep your food up high stuff, it came rushing back. Joe stepped outside with the flashlight. I stayed inside and waited, heart pounding in my ears. A second later, I heard Joe let out a soft snort, and then a louder shuffle. Something small flapped its wings. He came back into the tent and zipped it shut. "Duck," he said, almost laughing. "Just a duck." I didn't believe him until the next morning, when I saw the tracks around the fire pit. Webbed feet. A single bold duck had waddled through our campsite in the dead of night, pecked at an empty granola wrapper I'd stupidly left near my sleeping bag, and wandered off. I felt kind of dumb for being so scared. But that's the thing, they don't tell you how creepy silence can be. How your mind fills in the blanks when you're far from home. How even small noises become something bigger when there's no backup. No neighbors, no phones, no way out except your own legs and a canoe. We stayed 2 more nights. Nothing else happened, but I never quite relaxed again. Even when we sat by the fire or caught a couple of northern pike on the lake, I felt like the trees were too quiet, like the whole forest had eyes. We packed up on the 7th day and paddled back the way we came. My arms burned from the effort, and I was sunburned and mosquito-bitten, but I was ready to be done. I didn't say it out loud, but I wanted a road, a car, a gas station bathroom. I wanted the hum of a fridge, the sound of a TV, even traffic. Anything but that vast, thick, pressing silence. When I got home, my parents asked how the trip went. I told them it was fun. I told them about the fishing, the canoe, the loons. I didn't tell them how scared I'd been that night with the beaver. I didn't tell them how my legs had gone stiff from fear at the thought of a bear in our camp. And I sure didn't tell them that a single duck had made me jump out of my skin. Looking back now, I think that trip changed me. Not in some big, dramatic way, but it made me understand that nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't hate you, but it's not watching out for you either. The forest will keep being the forest, whether you're in it or not. It's up to you to figure out how to move through it without letting your fear get the best of you. But I still remember that sound, that deep, violent slap on the water. It still wakes me up sometimes, and I still think, for a split second, that someone is out there, waiting. The summer of 1989 was the year I nearly lost my father. At the time, he was in his early 40s, fit as a fiddle, and always looking for any excuse to get into the wilderness. A long weekend camping trip in the mountains was just what he needed after a few months of grinding away in his office job. He had always been an outdoorsman, especially in the Colorado Rockies, where he'd been hiking and camping since he was a teenager. That summer, he and his best friend, Dave, decided to take their usual week-long trek through the wilderness of the Flatirons, an area just outside Boulder, Colorado. The two of them had been on these treks countless times before, and they knew what to expect. Remote mountain ridges, dense forests, the occasional creek crossing, and nights around the campfire under the starlit sky. It was a time for camaraderie and reflection, away from the constant buzz of the city and the pressures of family life. But this trip, this one would be different. The first few days of their trip were uneventful, as was customary. They hiked from morning till evening, their packs weighed down with enough food and gear to keep them sustained for the entire week. On the 3rd day, after a long climb up a particularly grueling ridge, they found a small ravine that seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. It was tucked away from the main trail, quiet, and sheltered by thick trees on either side. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the landscape, and the wind was just strong enough to rustle the branches overhead. Dad had always been the cautious one in the group, meticulous about choosing camp spots. But this time, he was more relaxed. The ravine was calm and still. He thought it would be a peaceful place to spend the night. They set up their tents quickly, built a fire, and ate dinner under the stars. It was exactly what they needed. A quiet night with nothing but the sounds of the forest surrounding them. There were no signs of danger, no animals, no strange noises. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But something was off, and Dad couldn't shake the feeling. As he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, he felt an odd sensation on the back of his neck, like he was being watched. He brushed it off at first, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at him like a tick that wouldn't let go. That night, after the fire had burned down to embers and the others were settling into their tents, Dad decided he needed to step outside for a moment. He unzipped the flap of his tent, slipped into his boots, and headed off into the darkness to relieve himself. The moon was barely visible through the canopy of trees, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Dad tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine, focusing on the task at hand. But as he made his way past the fire pit and into the trees, he froze. There, just beyond the edge of the campsite, stood a pair of pale, bare feet. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized the feet were real, too real. They were standing just out of the firelight, nearly invisible in the shadows, the skin sickly white and blotchy. The toes were curled slightly, as if the person, whoever they were, had been standing there for a while. The feet looked old, weathered, with a small lump on the ankle of the right foot. Dad's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but he felt an overwhelming sense of danger wash over him. His body tensed, and for a split second, he considered running back to the tent. But then, before he could move, the feet shifted slightly, as if the person was aware of his presence. He bolted back toward the tent, barely managing to unzip the flap before he scrambled inside. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled to zip the tent shut behind him. He knew he had to tell the others, but the words caught in his throat. What would they think? They were all experienced outdoorsmen. But what if someone was out there in the dark? He lay there in the silence of the tent for a few moments, trying to calm himself. It was just a person, right? Maybe someone else was hiking through the area, and he had simply stumbled upon them. But why were their feet bare? Why were they so far from the trail? The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. He had to tell someone. "Dave," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "Dave, wake up." Dave stirred in his sleeping bag, groaning in annoyance. "What's wrong, man? I saw something. Someone's out there, barefoot. I don't know who, but their feet looked wrong." Dave was quiet for a moment, probably processing the words. "What do you mean, wrong?" Dad struggled to find the words. They were pale, old-looking. One of them had a lump on the ankle. There was another pause. "You sure you saw what you saw?" Dad nodded. "I'm sure. We need to check it out." Dave cursed under his breath, but he wasn't one to argue. They both grabbed their flashlights, and with their hearts racing, they stepped outside the tent. The forest around them was still, too still. They shined their lights into the dark, sweeping the area where Dad had seen the feet. There was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything unusual, but Dad was convinced. "It was right here," he insisted, pointing to the spot where the feet had been. "I swear, I saw them." All right, Dave muttered. "Let's walk around. Maybe we'll catch whoever it was." They walked around the campsite, calling out into the night, their flashlights bouncing erratically as they searched. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, Dave finally stopped. "All right," he said, turning to Dad. "If someone's out there, they're gone now. We need to move. It's not worth the risk." Dad blinked, not sure he understood at first. "Move? Move where?" "Up the hill. We need to get out of here." "Why?" Dave looked at him seriously, his expression grim. "Because I think I know who those feet belong to." The next morning, the sun rose in a pale, quiet sky. The group packed up their camp and moved to a safer spot higher up the hill, away from the ravine. They didn't discuss it much, but the weight of the previous night hung over them. It was hard to shake the feeling that something had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They didn't find out why until they returned to town a few days later. That was when Dave told Dad that his grandfather, whom he had been very close to, had passed away just a month earlier. The old man had always been a fixture in his life, someone who had guided him in both the outdoors and in life. In his final days, his grandfather had said something that Dave had almost forgotten about until the night in the ravine. "I'll always be watching over you." The feet Dad had seen that night, those pale, blotchy old feet, reminded Dave of his grandfather's. The lump on the ankle, that was something his grandfather had had in his later years, a result of an old injury. Dad didn't believe in the supernatural, but he couldn't help but feel that there was something about that night that had saved their lives. Maybe it wasn't the feet themselves, but the warning they had given. A warning so real that it felt like something beyond ordinary perception. A few days after they had moved camp, the weather turned. Heavy rainstorms rolled in, and the ravine they had camped in was hit by a flash flood that swept through the area with terrifying speed. Had they stayed, they would have been caught in it. There's no doubt in Dad's mind that they would have been swept away, possibly never to be found. It wasn't some mysterious force that saved them. It was a combination of instincts, warnings, and the strange sense of something bigger at play. No matter what anyone else might say, Dad knew they had been lucky to escape that night. For years afterward, he would tell the story to anyone who would listen, but always with one point to drive home. Sometimes the smallest things, like a pair of pale feet, are the things that can change everything. I'd been hiking for hours, the chill of late fall creeping into my bones as I slowly made my way up the steep, winding trail. The Cascades, with their vast expanses of trees and jagged cliffs, were as beautiful as they were intimidating. It was a quiet day on the trail, far too cold for most people to brave, but I had always loved this season. The trees were dressed in shades of amber, gold, and red, their leaves fluttering to the ground like confetti in the crisp mountain air. It was the kind of solitude that made me feel both small and connected to the wild. My dog, Molly, a massive 80-pound black lab, was beside me as always. Her energy was endless, even in the cold, but I could tell the hike was starting to tire her. We had stopped for a break halfway up the trail, where the steep incline forced us to rest. I sat on a large rock that jutted out beside the path, pulling my jacket tighter around myself to ward off the growing chill. Molly, always the social one, lay down at my feet but kept her ears perked, alert to the sounds of the forest around us. The trail had been mostly empty when I started out. Hiking in late fall meant fewer people, just the dedicated few, and most of them tended to be much quicker than I was, powering through the steep climbs as if the cold didn't bother them. I had planned this trip alone, mostly because it felt good to be away from everything and everyone. I loved the solitude, even the quiet little voice in my head that reminded me I could do this alone, without anyone else to worry about. The time for self-reflection was now. After catching my breath, I took a swig from my water bottle, staring out across the valley. The distant mountain peaks were shrouded in mist, and the air felt heavy. I had checked the weather before heading out, and though it was supposed to be clear, there was an ominous feeling hanging in the air, like something about this place wanted to stay hidden. I hadn't thought much of it until I heard the crunching of gravel behind me. My instincts kicked in, and I glanced over my shoulder. 2 men were descending the trail, slowly making their way toward me. At first, I thought nothing of it. It wasn't unusual to pass other hikers, but as they grew closer, I noticed a small unease creeping up my spine. They weren't talking, which seemed strange. Most hikers are friendly, even if they're not stopping for a chat, and a smile or a simple wave is usually shared. The men looked to be in their 30s, both of them wearing heavy packs and dressed in layers to keep warm. They were about 6 feet tall, with dark hair, both wearing beanies and thick coats. The one on the left was a little broader in build, while the other seemed a bit leaner. Neither of them had the look of seasoned hikers. Their movements were a bit too stiff, like they weren't used to being on a rugged trail. When they came into view, I gave them a polite wave, as I always do with passing hikers. "Hi," I said, but I kept my tone neutral, not wanting to sound too eager. They waved back, but there was something off about the way the one on the right smiled at me. Slow, almost too deliberate. I chalked it up to my nerves, the cold, and the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just passing through. As they got closer, the guy who had been walking a few steps behind suddenly said, "Oh, you're alone." His tone wasn't quite accusatory, but it made my stomach tighten. He said it with an odd, almost too casual smile, as if the fact that I was alone on this trail was some sort of curiosity. He turned to his friend, giving him a brief look, just a glance, but it was enough to make me uneasy. It wasn't a look of concern or recognition. It was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I noticed Molly immediately perk up. She raised her head, her stance stiffening as she stood up from the rock and placed herself between me and the 2 men, her eyes narrowing as she focused on them. The men, seeing this, reacted immediately. I saw their faces change in an instant, no longer friendly or casual, but suddenly guarded, as if they had read the situation and didn't want to test her. Without saying another word, they hastened their steps, continuing their descent down the trail without looking back. Molly didn't move from her position, staring at their retreating figures with a low growl starting in her throat. I rubbed her fur gently, trying to calm her down, but I couldn't ignore the tight knot that had formed in my own stomach. What had that been? A random comment? A casual remark? Or had they been sizing me up, making sure I was truly alone before moving on? I couldn't tell, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. My instincts were screaming that I needed to be more careful from here on out. I had been alone on the trail before, but something about this felt different. Something felt wrong. I decided then and there that I would make camp at a much more secluded spot that night. The trail had a few campsites nearby, but they were all on the main route, easily visible from the path. Not that I expected anyone to be out here at this time of year, but the whole situation had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. As I continued up the trail, the light began to fade, and the chill of the evening settled in deeper. Molly and I pressed on, the sound of our boots crunching through the dry leaves the only noise that filled the quiet forest. My breath came out in little clouds, and I found myself glancing behind me every few moments, just to make sure no one was following. I had originally planned to hike to a more open meadow, but the thought of setting up camp near the trailhead now seemed too risky. Instead, I veered off the main path, heading into a thicket of trees that seemed less traveled. It was colder here, the trees denser, and the path narrowed to a mere suggestion of a trail. But it felt safer. At least here, I could keep my camp hidden, and if anyone was foolish enough to try anything, they'd have to work a lot harder to find me. The camp I chose was simple but adequate. It was a small clearing by a creek, tucked away enough that it wouldn't be seen unless someone knew exactly where to look. The ground was covered with pine needles, and I could smell the earthy scent of moss and damp wood in the air. I set up my tent quickly, grateful for the quiet of the place, and began preparing a small fire to ward off the chill of the night. As I worked, Molly lay nearby, watching me carefully. I kept the fire low, just enough to provide some warmth without drawing too much attention. The sky darkened, the stars slowly starting to emerge from the growing darkness above. I could hear the sound of the creek rushing nearby, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional call of a distant animal. The night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but I kept the fire going, eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Molly remained alert, too, never fully lying down, always keeping her watchful gaze on the tree line. In the morning, I packed up quickly and left the campsite without lingering. I made my way back down the trail, heart rate returning to normal as I passed the places where the two men had appeared the day before. There were no signs of them now, no lingering footsteps or oddities. It seemed as though they had just disappeared, leaving no trace. I never found out if they were just two guys out for a hike or something else. I didn't want to know. I had learned the hard way to trust my gut, and my gut told me to move on. As I reached the trailhead and saw my car parked in the lot, I felt a rush of relief. The woods behind me now seemed less intimidating, and the air felt less oppressive. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be hiking alone in that part of the Cascades again. Some things aren't meant to be figured out, and some places are best left unexplored. I never thought much about the kind of people who walk around in forest preserves early in the morning. I just assumed most of them were like me, normal people trying to get a bit of peace and exercise before starting their day. That's how my routine started. In the spring of 2016, after my doctor told me I needed to work on my blood pressure, I began hiking at this preserve just outside of town called Willow Creek Woods. It was about 15 minutes from my apartment in Springfield, Illinois, and if I got up early enough, I could get in a full 3-mile loop before I had to rush home, shower, and make it to my job at the local office for the utility company. At first, the walks were nothing more than a quiet way to start my mornings. The trail cut through the woods, circling a little pond, crossing 2 narrow wooden bridges, and then veering back around past a small hill covered in tall grass and wildflowers. There were benches along the way, and signs that pointed out certain birds or plant life. Most mornings, I saw maybe 2 or 3 other people, usually an older man with his dog or a woman in jogging clothes with her earbuds in. Everyone kept to themselves. We'd nod or give a small wave, but there was never much interaction. I liked it that way. I'm not really a social person first thing in the morning, and that quiet trail gave me space to think. I'd breathe in the damp, earthy smell of the trees and watch the way the light came through the leaves. It was a routine I started to depend on, a way to feel steady before the stress of work and bills and errands kicked in. By late May, I had my route and timing down perfectly. I'd park in the small gravel lot just after sunrise, around 5:45 a.m., and start walking the loop clockwise. There was a metal bathroom structure not far from the lot, just before the trail split around the pond. I rarely used it, but I always noted it mentally, just in case. It was a plain cinder block building with 2 doors, one for each gender, and a water fountain off to the side. It smelled like mildew and harsh cleaning chemicals, but it was functional. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday, May 24th, 2016. I remember the date clearly because it was 2 days before my mom's birthday, and I had been planning to drive down to Decatur to visit her that weekend. That morning started like any other. I woke up before my alarm, pulled on some black leggings and a gray zip-up hoodie, and grabbed a protein bar for the drive. It was already warm out, even before the sun had fully risen. I remembered thinking I should have worn a short-sleeve shirt, but I was too lazy to change again. I filled my water bottle and left the apartment just after 5:30. The parking lot was empty when I got there, which wasn't unusual. I stretched next to my car, unlocked my phone to check the time, 5:46, and then started the loop. Everything felt normal at first. Birds chirping, the crunch of gravel under my shoes, a soft breeze moving the tree branches. I walked at a steady pace, passing the little hill and the old oak tree with a hollow at the base that someone had filled with smooth stones. I passed the wooden bridge and made my way around the pond. About 15 minutes in, I glanced back like I sometimes did, mostly to check if I was still alone. That's when I saw him. He was far behind me, maybe a few hundred feet, walking in the same direction. A man in a black hoodie and dark jeans. He didn't have a dog, and he wasn't jogging. He was just walking. Not fast, not slow, just walking. At first, I didn't think much of it. Other people used the trail. Maybe he had just started a little later than I had. I turned back around and kept walking. A few minutes later, something made me glance back again. He was still there, a little closer now. It was subtle but noticeable, maybe 50 feet closer than before. He wasn't doing anything outwardly alarming, but something about the way he walked, purposeful, almost mechanical, made my stomach tighten. I picked up my pace a bit. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he just walked fast. Maybe he didn't even notice me. I turned a corner, walked another stretch near the tall grass. I passed a bench and a cluster of wild daisies growing near the edge of the trail. I fought the urge to look again, but I couldn't help it. Closer. He was definitely closer. It didn't make sense. I had increased my speed, but he was still gaining on me. Not running, not even jogging. Just walking, but with this unsettling steadiness, like he had nowhere else to be. My heart started to race. I told myself maybe he was just going to pass me. Maybe I was being overdramatic. Still, I moved faster. The trail curved sharply near the second wooden bridge. I thought maybe if I crossed it and took the dirt path that veered off toward the picnic area, I could lose him. I turned and walked as fast as I could without making it obvious I was scared. The trail narrowed and the trees grew thicker in that part. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I didn't look back this time. I didn't want to see him, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, crunching footsteps behind me. That's when I ran. I didn't think, didn't look, didn't care if I looked ridiculous. I sprinted toward the bathroom building near the entrance. It was the only place with a locked door. I didn't know if anyone else was around. I didn't want to scream. I just wanted to get away. My legs burned, and my breath came in sharp, wheezing gasps. I cleared the final bend and saw the squat concrete building just ahead. The light above the women's door was still on from the night before. I reached it, yanked the handle. It opened, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The echo of my breathing filled the small space. It smelled sour like urine and bleach. My eyes darted around. There was a single toilet, a grimy sink, and a small, high window that was too narrow for anyone to squeeze through. I pressed my back to the wall next to the door and held my breath. Seconds passed. Then I heard footsteps again, this time just outside. Then the handle rattled hard. I felt it through the metal of the door. Then came the pounding, loud, sharp, angry. He yanked on the handle again and again. The whole door shook. I didn't make a sound. I was too scared to move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone when I pulled it out. I turned off the volume so it wouldn't make any noise, but I didn't dial anyone. I just stared at the screen, paralyzed. The pounding continued for at least a minute. Then finally it stopped. Silence. I didn't know if he was still out there. I didn't dare look. I stayed frozen in place, listening. Every second felt like a full minute. My heart was pounding so loud I thought he might hear it through the wall. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard another sound. Footsteps again, this time lighter. Then a voice. Not shouting, just a voice. Male. I didn't recognize the tone. But then I heard another set of footsteps. Heavier, hurried, crunching the gravel. I heard someone yell something, then more running. A scuffle, movement, then nothing. I waited another 10 minutes, maybe 15. I didn't look at my phone. I just waited. My knees were shaking so badly I had to sit on the grimy floor. When I finally opened the door, the lot was no longer empty. A man in running clothes was standing near the bathroom building, talking on his phone. He saw me and waved, clearly trying to show he wasn't a threat. I didn't wave back. I didn't say anything. I just walked straight to my car, unlocked it, got in, and drove home. I didn't go to work that day. I called in and said I wasn't feeling well. I didn't mention the woods. I didn't mention the man or the bathroom or any of it. I took a long shower, locked every door and window in my apartment, and sat on my couch for hours with the TV on, not watching it. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just sat there, frozen. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the Springfield Parks Department. I don't know how they got my number. Maybe the man who had helped, whoever he was, told them. They asked if I was okay. I said I was. They told me someone matching the description I gave had been seen in the preserve before, and they were looking into it. That was all. No one ever followed up. I never went back to Willow Creek Woods after that. I started walking at the mall in the mornings instead. Indoors, cameras everywhere, other people around. It wasn't peaceful, but I didn't care. I just wanted to feel safe. I still think about that morning sometimes. About the way he kept getting closer, steady and quiet. About how he never said a word, not even while trying to force open that door. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't run fast enough, or if the door had been broken, or if that other man hadn't shown up. I don't know what that guy's plan was. I don't want to know, but I know what I felt, and I know I'll never take a walk in the woods alone again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that feels perfect for a solo hike. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape of the Australian bush. The trail I was on stretched out before me, winding between scattered trees and rocky outcrops, with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The air smelled dry, faintly tinged with eucalyptus, and the warmth of the day still clung to the earth. I had been walking for a couple of hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty around me. I was in the middle of nowhere, a few hours' drive from the nearest town, and I had only a rough idea of the trail's layout. It wasn't the kind of hike many people would do alone. Remote, isolated, and not really well marked, but I had grown to enjoy the quiet of being out here. It wasn't so much about the destination as it was about the journey, about clearing my mind, being far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. As I continued down the trail, the sun's descent became more noticeable. The air began to cool rapidly, typical of the Australian desert climate at sunset. I wasn't in a desert, not exactly, but the climate here was harsh, and the temperature dropped sharply as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep orange at the edges, and shadows grew long, stretching across the dirt path ahead of me. I'd done this hike several times before, always around this time of day. It wasn't unusual for the temperature to change as quickly as it did. What was unusual, though, was how everything felt. I'd heard that the Australian bush had a way of playing tricks on the mind, but I had never felt anything like this before. The first thing I noticed was how quickly the sounds around me disappeared. The chirping of insects, the calls of birds, even the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. It all just stopped. One moment, the bush was alive with sound, and the next, it was dead silent. It wasn't like a gradual fade either. It was instant, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence wasn't peaceful, though. It was heavy, oppressive. Felt like the world had paused. At that moment, a strange, primal fear began creeping up my spine. It wasn't an immediate panic, but it was unmistakable. My body reacted before my mind could even catch up. It was the kind of fear you feel when you know you're being watched, when something just isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. It was so intense, it felt like my body was telling me to run. Even though I couldn't see anything unusual, I stopped in my tracks, trying to shake off the feeling. I looked around, expecting to see some kind of animal, maybe a snake or a kangaroo, but there was nothing at all. The trail ahead of me was empty, and the dense bush around me was still. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, watching, waiting. My heart started to race, my breath growing shallow. I turned around, expecting to see some movement, but there was nothing, just the empty trail behind me, stretching back toward the way I had come. But that feeling, that presence, didn't go away. It only grew stronger. It's hard to explain why, but at that moment, my body took over. I started running. I didn't know why. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. But the fear, that primal instinct to flee, it pushed me to move faster. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't analyzing the situation. I just ran, faster than I had ever run down a trail in my life. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the dry soil crunching with each step as I made my way down the trail. The trees blurred past me, their long shadows stretching over the path. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning from the sudden exertion. But I couldn't stop. The feeling that something was behind me, following me, wouldn't let me. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but I felt it. I pushed myself harder, my footfalls echoing in the silence, the world around me still eerily quiet. The fear was all-encompassing now. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, a suffocating presence that seemed to stretch across the entire bush. I could hear nothing, no wind, no insects, no birds. It was like the world had gone mute. I ran for what felt like forever, my mind blank except for the need to escape. The temperature had dropped even more, and a chill had crept into my skin, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Something in my gut told me that if I stopped, I would never be able to start again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound returned. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling in the trees, a distant chirp from a bird. Then, slowly, the world began to fill with sound again. The insects resumed their buzzing, the birds began calling from the trees, and the wind kicked up, sending a dry breeze through the leaves. The silence was gone. The normal sounds of the bush were back, as if nothing had ever happened. I slowed to a stop, my chest heaving, my legs trembling from the adrenaline and the fear. I looked around, breathing heavily, my heart still pounding. The trail ahead of me was empty, just like it had been when I had first turned around. There was nothing there, no sign of any animal, no indication that anything unusual had happened. But the fear, it was still there. That deep, bone-chilling terror hadn't completely faded. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. Maybe I had just gotten spooked by the sudden silence. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I'd been hiking alone for hours in the Australian bush. It was easy to let your mind wander, to convince yourself that something was out there when it wasn't. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me. Eventually, I turned back around and started walking again, this time at a slower pace. The temperature had dropped so much that I had to pull my jacket tighter around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the air itself was different, like the world had shifted in some subtle way that I couldn't quite put into words. The trail stretched out in front of me, as quiet and still as ever, but I kept my eyes on the path ahead, unwilling to look behind me. As the sky darkened and the last light of day disappeared, I made my way back to the car. The silence had returned, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. I wasn't being followed anymore. The feeling had faded, but the fear lingered, like a faint memory of something that had been real. I've been back to the same trail many times since that day. Same time of day, same season, same path. I've never experienced anything like what happened that afternoon. The silence has come and gone. The shadows have stretched long over the trail, and the temperature has dropped sharply, just as it always does. But I've never felt that same primal fear again. Still, when I think about that day, about the way the world went so suddenly silent, and the way I felt like something was watching me, it sends a chill down my spine. I don't know what it was, whether it was just my mind playing tricks or something else, but I do know that whatever it was real, and I can't forget it. I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing outside my tent. It was so loud, it jerked me out of a deep sleep. My heart started to pound almost immediately, and I found myself holding my breath, trying to understand what I was hearing. The breathing wasn't the kind of heavy panting you'd expect from an animal or a person after exertion. It wasn't like a bear after a sprint or a hiker who just climbed a steep hill. This was deep, deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if something large was standing right outside, carefully controlling its breathing. I lay there completely still, my mind racing. I couldn't even tell what direction it was coming from, just that it was loud enough to shake the thin walls of my tent. It was no animal I knew of, and there were no other sounds. No wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant animal calls. Just that breath. I glanced over at my watch. It was 2:37 a.m. The campsite was eerily quiet. Not a single sound of the forest at night that should have been there. I could hear the breathing clearly, as if it was just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I've camped alone in remote parts of the mountains for years, and I've heard the normal nighttime sounds. A bear snuffling around the camp, the distant hoot of an owl, maybe a fox barking. But this was different. It was deliberate. It wasn't the sound of an animal searching for food. It felt more like a presence, something big, standing, waiting, watching. I slowly reached for my shotgun, which I had left beside my sleeping bag. The heavy weight of the gun in my hand didn't bring me comfort. I wasn't sure if I could even get a shot off in time if whatever it was decided to charge. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to slow it down, focusing on the sound outside. The deep inhale, then the slow exhale. It was almost rhythmic, like it was listening for my response, gauging how close I was to panic. I didn't dare move. My eyes darted around the inside of the tent. The shadows of the trees outside shifted under the moonlight, casting weird shapes against the tent fabric. It made it harder to focus on anything. I had to remind myself to stay calm. I had been through this before, hunting out here for years, dealing with bears, mountain lions, even the occasional bobcat, but nothing had ever made me feel like this. The breathing continued. It wasn't getting any closer, but it wasn't moving away either. It was as though it was simply standing there, watching, waiting for me to do something. I knew the night wasn't going to get any better, and I wasn't sure how long I could lay there listening to it. I decided to load the shotgun. My fingers fumbled with the shells for a moment before I clicked the pump into place, the metallic sound too loud in the stillness. I pressed my back to the side of the tent, my breath shallow. The tent walls barely offered any protection from what was outside, and I couldn't tell if whatever it was knew I was awake. I could feel the tension in the air, a kind of charged silence that only came when something dangerous was nearby. I thought about what it could be. A bear? Too large to be stealthy. A mountain lion? Too quiet, no paw steps. This didn't feel like an animal at all. The minutes dragged on. I stared at the dark canvas of the tent, hearing nothing but the heavy, clear breath punctuating the night air. Felt like hours passed. Maybe it was only 2 or 3 minutes. But time seemed to slow down when you're waiting for something dangerous to happen. My body was frozen in place, every muscle tense, every nerve alert. My mind raced through the possibilities. If this was an animal, it would have moved by now. But there was nothing, no movement, just that breathing. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an odd animal, one I had never encountered before. Or maybe it was just a particularly large bear sniffing around. But that didn't make sense either. Bears don't just stand there, breathing heavily. They don't make their presence known like this. They don't just wait outside your tent in the dead of night, breathing as if they're contemplating their next move. Then, for just a moment, the breathing stopped. It was sudden, like a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it leaving? Had it finally moved away? Or was it just waiting for me to make a sound? I had no choice but to wait. The moments stretched on. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to find any explanation, any reason for the odd event, but nothing made sense. All I could do was hold my breath and listen for any movement. Another minute passed. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the breathing began again. But this time it was more faint, softer, almost like it was farther away. I didn't dare make a move. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, afraid it would hear me. I stayed there in the cold, hard silence, just waiting. The breathing seemed to last forever. It grew softer again, and this time it didn't return. The moment felt like a lifetime, but then, at last, the sound just stopped altogether. No more breathing, no more rustling or footsteps or anything. I waited a few more minutes, not daring to move, not daring to believe what I was hearing or feeling. It felt like it was still there, just beyond the tent, but I couldn't hear the breathing anymore. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed perfectly still, my fingers still gripping the shotgun. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every hour seemed to last longer than the last. Every little noise outside, every rustling of the wind in the trees, every snapping of a twig made me jump. But I never heard the breathing again. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The sun was barely up, and everything around me seemed normal. No signs of anything out of place. No animal tracks around the tent. No disturbed ground. Nothing. I spent the entire morning looking over the area, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what had happened. There was nothing. No footprints. No claw marks. No scent trails. The forest was still untouched. It was as if the night had never happened. But I knew it did. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound was too real. The pressure in the air was too thick. Something had been out there, something large. I don't know what it was. I've heard my share of animals and wild things in the woods, but this was something else. I've never felt fear like that before, and I don't think I ever will again. As I packed up my gear and left the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I had never been so shaken, even after all my years in the wild. But I didn't go back to the same spot again. I didn't even want to camp alone again, not after that night. To this day, I don't know what it was that stood outside my tent. Maybe it was a bear, though I've never heard anything like it from one of those. Maybe it was something else entirely, something I can't explain. But whatever it was, I'm not going to forget it. I learned something about myself that night. I learned that even the most experienced can be scared. Even the most prepared can be caught off guard. And sometimes, in the woods, you're never really alone. In August of 2016, I took a solo hiking trip up into the northern part of Ontario, not far from the edge of Lake Nipigon. I was 32 at the time, single, no kids, just working a contract IT job that gave me chunks of time off between assignments. I'd always liked the outdoors and had done a few multi-day hikes through Algonquin and the Adirondacks. But this time, I wanted to go somewhere a little more remote. I'd heard about the wildness of the Canadian Shield, how the land was old and scarred, full of exposed granite, lakes, pines, and long silences. That was what I was looking for, silence. I planned a 5-day hike through a rugged section of Crown land north of the small town of Beardmore. There were no real trails out there, just some old snowmobile paths, logging roads, and a few faded portages between lakes. I used a topographic map, plotted my route by compass and GPS backup, and packed my gear for total self-sufficiency: tent, food, stove, emergency radio, the works. I didn't plan on seeing anyone else out there. That was the appeal. It took me most of a day to hike out from the dirt road where I parked. By the time I reached the first granite ridge, I was sweating hard and my legs were already aching. The terrain was beautiful but rough. Long patches of lichen-covered rock, little black spruce trees growing out of cracks in the stone, deep clear pools and creeks that ran cold even in the summer. It was the kind of place where you felt small, not in a poetic way, in a real way, like the land didn't care if you twisted an ankle or disappeared. It wouldn't notice. The first couple nights were quiet. I set up camp near small lakes where loons called at dusk, and the air was heavy with the smell of pine sap and mud. I saw moose tracks in the mud along one creek, heard something big moving through the brush the second night, but never saw anything. I followed my planned route by compass, checked in with my GPS, and kept a slow, careful pace. I didn't want to get cocky. Out here, a simple mistake could ruin your trip or your life. I kept a tight camp, hung my food from trees, and stayed alert. On the third night, everything changed. That day, I had climbed over a long, exposed ridge of bare pink granite. The heat was intense. No shade up there, just sun bouncing off the rock and sweating out of you nonstop. I made it down into a shallow valley full of short jack pines and swampy lowland. And I knew from the map that there was a small lake not far to the east. I bushwhacked through the trees, my shirt soaked through, swatting black flies that seemed to come in clouds. By early evening, I found the lake. A still, oval-shaped patch of dark water surrounded by low trees and mossy shoreline. No signs of human use. No fire rings, no old paths, no garbage. Just untouched backcountry. I picked a spot along the west side, on a slightly raised patch of granite that sloped gently down to the water. It was breezy enough to keep most of the bugs down, and I could see fish jumping out in the lake. Perfect campsite. I pitched my small one-person tent just back from the shore, set up my stove, and made dinner: instant rice, a pouch of tuna, and some powdered soup. Nothing fancy. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the lake went glassy and the air cooled fast. The quiet was intense. No birdsong, no frogs, just the sound of the breeze in the trees and the occasional splash from the lake. I cleaned up carefully, packed away all food scraps, and hung my food bag from a tree about 30 feet from my tent. I'd done everything by the book. I even packed away my trash and used some unscented soap to wash my hands and face. I didn't want to attract bears or anything else. By the time it was fully dark, I was zipped into my sleeping bag, stretched out on my foam mat, and listening to the gentle whisper of wind over the water. I was tired but content, the kind of tired you earn. My legs were sore, my back ached, but it felt good. I drifted off around 10:30. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. I didn't check my watch, but it was full dark, and I was immediately alert. I didn't hear anything at first, just that strange stillness you get deep in the woods. No crickets, no wind, just the kind of quiet that feels heavy. I lay there for a few seconds, heart already speeding up, ears wide open. Then I heard it crunching, not far off, on rock. It was the unmistakable sound of something walking across bare granite. Not shuffling like a small animal, deliberate steps, soft, slow, spaced out. Then another crunch, closer, then a pause. I held my breath. Another step. It was coming toward my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even want to breathe loud. My brain was already racing. Bear? Moose? Person? But a person didn't make sense. Nobody else would be out here. I was miles from any road or trail. The footsteps moved closer. Then I heard a second set. Then a third. A small scraping sound, like claws on stone. Then more crunching. Something brushed against the side of my tent. I froze. The fabric flexed slightly, just the lightest touch, like a nose or a paw testing it. Then I heard sniffing. Loud, close, snuffling breath through nostrils. Whatever it was right there. Then something else nudged the opposite side of the tent. A second shape brushed past the rear. I heard paws shifting on rock, small stones kicked aside. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. My bear spray was at my side, tucked in the mesh pocket of the tent wall. My fixed blade knife was in my boot near the door. Neither of those made me feel any better. If this was a bear, I didn't want to provoke it. If it was more than one animal, that was worse. I couldn't tell how many were out there. Then something bumped my tent hard. The wall bent inward, then sprang back. My heart slammed into my ribs. I almost made a sound but clamped my jaw shut. I reached slowly, painfully slowly, for my flashlight. It was next to my head on top of my pack. I held it but didn't turn it on. The sniffing continued. I could hear claws scratching lightly against the tent floor. Then I heard breathing. Heavy. Close. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe. Fear makes people do strange things. I couldn't see through the tent. It was a low-profile one, just big enough for me, and the sides were opaque. I wanted to know what was out there, so I leaned forward, slowly unzipped the small mesh panel near the top of the door, and peeked out. I saw eyes, not glowing, not otherworldly, just reflections in the dim starlight. Then I saw shapes, gray and white fur, lean bodies, ears, wolves. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, all spread out around the tent. Some were sniffing the ground near where I'd walked. One was standing about 4 feet from the tent door, staring right at me, not moving, just watching. I froze. We locked eyes for maybe 5 seconds. Then the wolf blinked, turned its head slightly, and sniffed the air. It didn't growl, didn't run. It just looked curious. Another one padded past the left side of the tent, its shoulder brushing the fabric again. They weren't acting aggressive, but they also weren't afraid. That scared me more than anything. I had expected wild animals to bolt the second they caught human scent. These didn't. I slowly closed the mesh flap and leaned back. I lay there for what felt like an hour. Every few minutes I heard more steps, more sniffing. Sometimes they brushed the tent. Sometimes I heard them lapping water down at the lake. Once I heard them growl at each other, low, guttural sounds of competition, not aimed at me. I didn't sleep, couldn't. At some point, the sounds faded. I don't know when. Maybe around 4 a.m., maybe earlier. The last sound I remember hearing was one of them shaking its fur, like a dog coming out of a bath. Then silence. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. I sat up in my sleeping bag, unzipped the tent door, and looked out. They were gone. The granite around the tent was covered in prints. Dozens of them. Some large, some small. I stood up slowly, scanned the tree line. Nothing. The lake was calm. The sun was just cresting the trees, turning the water gold. I found a place near the food bag tree and sat down. My hands were shaking. I hadn't been attacked. They hadn't even touched the food bag. They just investigated me. By noon, I had packed up and started hiking west. I was supposed to stay 2 more nights, but I couldn't. I was too wired, too spooked. Every sound in the woods set me on edge. A squirrel crashing through leaves made my heart jump. I kept checking behind me. I hiked out in one long day, didn't stop except for water. My knees were shot by the end of it. When I reached my truck, I didn't waste time. I tossed my gear in the back and drove straight to Thunder Bay, booked a cheap motel, and crashed hard. I reported the sighting to Ontario Parks and gave the GPS coordinates. They said wolf sightings were rare but not unheard of that far north. Probably a local pack. Probably just curious. That's all they said. For a while after, I can write that story for you, but it will take quite a bit of time, and I can't produce 7,000 plus words in one go here. Instead, I'll begin crafting a detailed and extended version. Then I can continue it in segments. Does that sound good to you? I'll make sure it's as realistic and chilling as possible. Let me get started on the first part. I had been hiking for years, enjoying the solitude of the mountains, the scent of pine and damp earth in the air, and the rhythmic crunch of dirt beneath my boots. But there's something about those quiet nights, especially when you're alone or in a small group, that can make your imagination run wild. It's not the fear of something supernatural. It's the creeping sensation of not being alone, even when you should be. It was early September 2023, and I was with two friends, Matt and Aaron. We decided on a late-night hike in the remote hills near a military base tucked into the mountains of central Washington. The area was known for its rugged terrain and the occasional military exercises that could be heard echoing through the valley, but we weren't concerned. We'd done hikes in much stranger, darker, and more isolated places before. This one just felt like any other right up until the end. We'd gotten an early start and hiked for a few hours. The sun was long gone, leaving only the sharp contrast of our headlamps piercing through the thick darkness of the trees. It was one of those cool nights, perfect for being out in the wilderness, but not so cold that we had to bundle up. The sounds of night crept around us, an owl hooting, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing that should have made me feel uneasy. Then, about halfway through the hike, Matt said he thought he heard something. It was hard to make out with the low hum of the wind, but he swore he heard a crack, like a heavy branch snapping somewhere ahead of us. We all paused, straining our ears, but all we could hear was the wind whipping through the trees. "Probably just a tree falling," I said. "It happens a lot out here." Matt shrugged, but he didn't seem convinced. Erin was already turning back to check the trail behind us, her eyes scanning the dark. But it was nothing, I thought, nothing we couldn't handle. We kept moving, climbing higher into the hills. My legs started to burn from the incline, and the exhaustion from the day weighed on me, but the peace of being in nature soothed my mind. That was until the noise came again. This time it was louder, a snap, sharp and close, like something, maybe even someone, stepping on a dry branch. I froze. Matt did too. Erin, ahead of us, turned with an almost unnerving calm, her expression unreadable under the glow of her headlamp. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice soft but filled with tension. "Yeah," I replied, but I wasn't sure what to say. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something larger, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. We decided to keep going, but now all of us were on edge. Every snap of a branch, every rustling of leaves underfoot made us all stop, look, and listen. We had no reason to be scared. This was just nature, right? We eventually reached the top of a small ridge, a clearing where the stars were visible through the gaps in the tree canopy. It felt like we had entered another world, one where the pressure of the day melted away. But even in that moment of serenity, I couldn't shake the unease that had begun to settle deep in my chest. We didn't linger long. The air was getting colder, and the sounds of the night seemed a little too loud now, more piercing. We turned back the way we came, deciding to head down to the car, but as we retraced our steps, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind us. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, too close for comfort. Every time I turned, the path behind us was empty, the shadows too deep to make out any form. Still, that feeling of being watched followed me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. By the time we reached the base of the trail, it was well past midnight. My legs ached from the climb, but there was a strange relief to be back at the parking lot. Our SUV was parked just a little ways off the main trail, tucked near some thick brush, where we'd left it hours earlier. We were ready to head back to town. Matt and Aaron were already at the car, getting their stuff together, but I lingered for a moment, looking out into the dark woods that we had just emerged from. The night felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I took one last look around, my eyes scanning the trees where we had walked earlier, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched hadn't left. That's when I noticed the prints. At first, I thought I was just tired and imagining things, but no, they were there, clear as day. Footprints, large ones, were all over the dust and dirt surrounding the car. They were too large for any animal I knew, and they didn't look human either. The prints were long, deep, and dragging, like something or someone had been moving slowly through the dust, and the marks had been left by something heavy, something big. I stepped closer, my headlamp lighting up the area around the car. The footprints were all over, some leading toward the back of the SUV, some veering off to the side into the brush. But it wasn't just the size of them that unsettled me. It was the way they seemed to drag along the ground, like the weight of whatever made them was too much to lift properly. Erin noticed them too, her face paling as she examined the prints. "Do you think it's military?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "Maybe some kind of prank?" I didn't know, but something didn't sit right. These prints weren't just human-sized, they were enormous, and they looked fresh, like they had been made just a few hours ago. There was no way an animal had done this. No bear, no wolf, no deer left prints like these. And if it had been a person, they would have had to be some kind of giant, dragging their feet like that. It didn't make sense. Matt suggested we take off, that we were probably just overthinking it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I didn't know if it was a prank from some local military personnel, given the base wasn't far from where we were. But the way those prints were made was so deliberate, it almost felt like a warning. Something primal. Something meant to unsettle us. We didn't hang around long. I didn't want to risk being there when whatever had made those prints came back. We piled into the car, and I was grateful to leave that eerie spot behind. But as we drove away, the unease never quite left. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something standing just beyond the trees, watching us. The drive back felt like a blur, the silence in the car thick with unspoken tension. We tried to shake it off, laughing it off as a weird experience. But I couldn't stop thinking about the prints, and the dragging motion. It was too deliberate, too real. Whoever or whatever made them had been right there watching us. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was just some prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had been out there, and it had been too close for comfort. Later, I did some research into the area. I found a few mentions online of strange things happening near that military base, strange occurrences, even rumors of sightings in the woods, but none of them were ever confirmed. I wondered if it was a coincidence, or if maybe the prints were just another way of showing us that the wilderness, especially near a military base, wasn't as empty as we'd thought. But no matter what, I would never forget the feeling of being watched, or the feeling that we had barely escaped whatever it was that had left those massive, dragging prints all around our car. Something was out there, and it was too real for me to ignore. It was the middle of February 2002. I was 17 years old, maybe just a few weeks shy of turning 18, and still in that weird phase between being a kid and trying to act like an adult. I grew up outside of a small town in central Saskatchewan, in the flat northern prairie region, where the forest crept into the farmland and rivers sliced through the hills like scars. Winter out, there was long and cold, and most nights dropped down to -20 or colder. It was the kind of cold that made metal crack and breath freeze to your scarf in seconds. But when you grew up there, you just got used to it. We didn't think much of it. Back then, I had an old Bravo snowmobile. It was a 250, if I remember right. Not fast, not powerful, but it got me around. I used it all winter to get between the farm and the small group of friends I had out in the bush and on the edge of the town. We'd use trails that the local farmers and hunters had made over the years, packed down paths between stands of spruce and poplar, winding between hills and frozen sloughs. I knew those trails like the back of my hand. I could ride them at night with just the headlight of the Bravo and the full moon if it was out. That night, I was heading back from a party that one of my friends had thrown in an old workshop near their place. Nothing big. Maybe 7 or 8 of us just hanging out, listening to music, trying to act older than we were. There was a fire barrel going, and someone had brought a small speaker, and yeah, we had a few beers. I wasn't drunk, but I wasn't exactly sharp either. The kind of buzz that makes you feel loose and warm inside, even though it's freezing cold outside. I left late, later than I should have, probably close to 1:30 or 2 in the morning. The moon was full and the sky was clear, one of those cloudless prairie nights where everything glows silver under the moonlight. The snow sparkled and the shadows of the trees stretched long and black across the ground. Felt like you could see forever. The Bravo's headlight wasn't strong, but with the moonlight bouncing off the snow, I didn't need much more. I had a 20-minute ride ahead of me, give or take. My trail wound through a few thick stretches of bush, across a couple of fields, and eventually crossed a small river that ran through the valley behind our land. That crossing was always frozen solid in the winter, especially in years like that one when we had weeks of -20 temperatures. I'd used that crossing probably 100 times before. Never once had I seen open water there in the winter. The first part of the ride was peaceful. I remember that clearly. The Bravo hummed steady under me, and the wind stung my cheeks through the scarf I had wrapped around my face. My goggles were starting to fog a little, so I lifted them up and just squinted into the cold air. The forest on either side of me blurred by in streaks of silver and black. I wasn't going that fast, maybe 40 or 50 kilometers an hour, but on a small machine like that, it felt faster than it was. I remember thinking that it was one of the most beautiful nights I'd ever seen. Just me, the moon, the trees, and the snow. The kind of quiet that only winter can bring. The kind of night that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. Then I got closer to the river. The trail started to narrow as it always did before the valley. The trees pressed in tighter, mostly black spruce and a few poplars, their trunks thin and straight like poles. The ground dipped slightly, and the snow got deeper between the trees. I let off the throttle a bit and leaned forward to keep the Bravo steady. I knew this part of the trail well, but it was easy to lose your balance if you weren't paying attention. Just as I started coming up on the final stretch before the river crossing, it happened. Something massive stepped out onto the trail. It was sudden. 1 second the trail was empty, and the next, this enormous figure moved right into the beam of my headlight. It was a moose, a huge one, bigger than any I'd ever seen before. Its coat was silver in the moonlight, not from age or anything like that, just the way the light caught on its fur. It looked like a statue, like something carved from metal. Its legs were long and dark, and its back rose higher than the handlebars on my Bravo. It stood broadside across the trail, completely blocking the path. I hit the brake hard and the Bravo skidded on the packed snow. My weight shifted forward so fast that my chest slammed into the handlebars. For a second, I thought I was going to fly over them, but the machine jerked to a stop just in time. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking. The moose didn't move. It just stood there. I sat there staring, my breath fogging up my goggles again. I reached up and pulled them off completely. My eyes stung from the cold air, but I wanted to see clearly. And in that moment, less than a few seconds, really, I blinked and the moose was gone. It didn't walk off. It didn't run. It didn't turn into the bush. It was just gone. I looked all around, heart still pounding, expecting to hear branches snapping or to see its back disappearing between the trees. But there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just me, my idling Bravo, and the open trail in front of me. I sat there for a good minute, confused, disoriented, and honestly a little scared. Not of the moose itself, but of the fact that I might have imagined it. I thought maybe the beers had caught up to me, or maybe I was overtired and seeing things. I shook my head, pulled my goggles back down, and took a few deep breaths to calm myself down. Then I started slowly forward again, heading toward the river. I only made it another 10 feet. That's when I saw the river, and it wasn't frozen. The ice was gone. The trail led straight into a wide patch of open, black water. The snow had melted back from the banks, and dark, wet mud lined the edges where the trail should have continued. I could see chunks of ice floating in the current. The water moved slowly, but it was moving. The surface shimmered under the moonlight like a giant piece of broken glass. I sat frozen on the Bravo, staring at the open water. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That river had always been frozen in February. Always. That crossing was known by everyone around as safe. Shallow, frozen solid. It was a shortcut that hunters and skidoo riders used every winter. I crossed it dozens of times, but not that night. I killed the engine and sat in total silence. The only sound was the faint gurgling of the river and the wind moving through the trees behind me. If I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't seen that moose, I would have gone straight into that water. I wouldn't have been able to stop in time. The Bravo didn't have the power or speed to skip across open water like some of the newer sleds. It would have sunk immediately. I would have gone in with it, alone, at -20 degrees, in the middle of the night. I thought about how far I was from help. Even if someone had known where I was, it would have taken at least 30 minutes to get to me, if I'd even been able to call for help. But I didn't have a phone. None of us really carried them around back then, especially not out on the trails. And even if I had one, there was no reception in that valley. I would have drowned, or frozen to death trying to crawl out. Either way, that would have been it. Eventually, I turned the Bravo around and took the long way home. It added another 30 minutes to my ride, but I didn't care. I stayed slow, careful, watching every shadow and every twist in the trail. By the time I got home, my hands were numb, my face was burning from wind chill, and my legs ached from tension. I parked the Bravo in the shed, went inside, and didn't say a word to anyone. I didn't tell my parents the next day. I didn't even tell my friends about the moose or the open river. Felt too strange, too lucky, like something I wasn't supposed to talk about. I kept thinking back to that moment, the way the moose had stepped out right in front of me, the way it had stopped me just in time, the way it vanished. But I never once thought of it as a ghost. I don't believe in that kind of thing. I still don't. What I believe is this: something made me stop. Whether it was instinct or exhaustion or just dumb luck. I don't know. Maybe I imagined the moose. Maybe my brain made something up to snap me out of my haze. But even if I imagined it, it still saved my life. Years later, I went back to that trail. It was summertime by then. I walked the whole stretch all the way to the riverbank where the crossing used to be. The ice was long gone, of course, but the banks were muddy and soft, and the river ran deeper than I remembered. I saw signs that the trail had shifted further upstream, to a spot where the ice tended to hold better in the winter. I guess others had found out that crossing wasn't safe anymore. I stood there for a long time, just looking across the water. The trees were taller and the undergrowth was thicker, but I could still picture that night. The moon, the snow, the cold air in my lungs, and that moose, real or not, standing there like a warning. I never used that trail again. Not in the winter, anyway. And now, even all these years later, I still think about that night. Not often, but once in a while. Usually in the winter, when I see a full moon over a field of snow, or when I catch a glimpse of a dark shape moving through the bush. And every time I do, I remember how close I came to not making it home. That's not something you forget. I was about 30 years old when I decided to get away from the noise of city life for a few days. It was late September in the northern part of British Columbia, out near Port Hardy. I had been itching to hike and camp somewhere remote for some time, so I packed up my gear and made the long drive up the coast to the islands near the northern tip of Vancouver Island. The idea of being in an isolated spot, surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and the ocean, sounded like exactly what I needed. After arriving at my destination, I unloaded my gear and started making my way down a small trail to find a suitable spot for camp. The path twisted through thick forests of tall evergreens, their branches heavy with moss. There wasn't a soul around for miles, just the occasional bird flying overhead, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant sound of waves crashing along the shore. It was peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. The campsite I set up was right by the beach, close enough to hear the rhythmic sound of the ocean as it lapped against the rocks. I figured it'd be perfect for a couple of days to unwind. It was still early afternoon when I arrived, so I decided to spend some time fishing, hoping to catch my dinner. I found a sturdy rock to sit on near the water and cast my line out. A few hours went by, the sun slowly dipping toward the horizon. It wasn't long before I hooked a decent-sized fish. Proud of my catch, I gathered some driftwood from the shore, built a fire, and roasted the fish over the flames. The evening passed quickly, and the sky turned dark. The air became cooler as the stars began to twinkle overhead. After a satisfying meal, I crawled into my tent, still feeling the warm glow of the fire on my skin. I zipped up the door and nestled into my sleeping bag. The gentle sound of the waves against the shore outside was soothing, and soon, I fell into a deep sleep. It wasn't long before I was abruptly woken up. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A heavy, labored breathing. It was unmistakable. It was like the kind of breath you might hear from something huge, a creature that had been running or was somehow winded. The sound came from somewhere outside my tent, just beyond the light of my fading campfire. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? The air outside was still, and the tide had come in, meaning the water had covered the area where the fire had been. I glanced at my watch. It was around 2:30 a.m. The beach was quiet, but I could still hear the breathing, deep, heavy, almost rhythmic. I couldn't place it at first, and my mind raced. Was it a bear? I quickly dismissed that thought. I knew bears didn't frequent these islands. I had done my research. In fact, the presence of bears here was so rare that there hadn't been a single documented encounter in this area for decades. I had come to the conclusion long ago that they were unlikely to be around, but hearing that breath made my stomach tighten. As the breath continued, my mind shifted gears. The urban legends I had heard growing up suddenly floated to the surface. Bigfoot. I chuckled quietly at myself. Bigfoot? Come on. I wasn't the type to believe in mythical creatures, not even a little. But still, there was something about the breathing that unsettled me. What if it wasn't a bear? What the hell else could it be? I lay there, frozen in my sleeping bag, debating whether I should stay in the tent or venture out. The breathing was close, too close for comfort. My flashlight was just a few feet away. I could grab it, shine it outside the tent, and maybe see what was out there. But what if it was something far worse than I could imagine? What if it was a bear? Or worse, something else? The sound continued, its rhythm growing louder. It was a low, heavy sound, almost like an exhale mixed with a growl. My breath caught in my throat. I had to know what it was. I couldn't just lie there and wonder. With every ounce of courage I had left, I finally reached over, grabbed the flashlight, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The air was cool, and the only sounds I could hear were the distant waves and the beating of my own heart. I shone the flashlight in every direction, scanning the beach for any movement. For a moment, everything was still. I felt a chill creeping up my spine, but then I heard it again, the deep, heavy breath, followed by a small splash, like something had shifted in the water. I swung my light toward the sound, and there, just a few yards from the shoreline, I saw it. At first, I thought I had to be imagining it, but as the beam of light focused, the shape became clearer. A massive orca whale, rolling around in the kelp just at the edge of the water. It was enormous, at least 25 feet long, and its sleek black and white body glistened under the moonlight. It seemed almost playful, thrashing in the seaweed, its huge dorsal fins slicing through the surface of the water. The splash I had heard earlier was likely just the whale moving, its immense body creating ripples that reached all the way to the shore. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. A part of me wanted to run, to scramble back into the safety of the tent. But another part of me, something deeper, more instinctual, wanted to stay to watch. I had read about orcas in books and seen them in documentaries, but nothing compared to seeing one in person, especially so close. I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded, staring at the whale as it slowly rolled through the kelp. It was a beautiful, wild animal, one that didn't belong in the same category as the predators I had feared earlier. The heavy breathing I had heard wasn't from something to be afraid of. It was the sound of something alive and free, not a terrifying creature lurking in the dark. As my mind calmed, I realized there was more to this scene. Just off the shore, I could see shadows bobbing in the water, more whales. They were floating in place, probably half asleep, their fins barely visible above the surface. There were at least 5 or 6 of them, each massive and powerful. I was witnessing something truly remarkable, something that most people would never get to see in their lifetime. I stayed there for what felt like hours, simply watching them. The whales moved gracefully through the water, sometimes rolling over to expose their white bellies, other times diving deeper beneath the surface. The sound of their breathing was calm now, just the gentle rhythm of the ocean mixed with their exhales. It was surreal. The longer I watched, the more I realized how insignificant my fears had been. I had allowed myself to get worked up over nothing. There were no bears, no Bigfoot, just these magnificent creatures, far more powerful and impressive than anything I had imagined. I felt a deep sense of awe, as though I had been allowed a glimpse into a hidden world, one that few people ever would. By the time I noticed the whales had drifted farther out to sea, it was well into the early hours of the morning. The night had shifted from terrifying to awe-inspiring. I was still awake, but the fear that had gripped me earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. I could hear the faint sound of the waves, the gentle splash of the ocean as it kissed the shore. The whales were gone, but I knew they would continue their journey in the deep, cold waters of the northern Pacific. I decided not to sleep. There was no point. The magic of the moment had left me wide-eyed and alert. Eventually, the sun began to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the water. I packed up my camp slowly, feeling a sense of gratitude for the strange, wild night I had experienced. It was something I would never forget. I made my way back down the trail later that morning, my pack slung over my shoulder, my mind still buzzing with what I had witnessed. The world felt different now, more alive, more connected. I had set out to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and I had found something far more powerful than I could have expected. That night on the beach had been terrifying at first, but it turned into one of the most incredible experiences of my life. And as I walked back to my car, I realized that sometimes it's the things you fear the most that end up being the most awe-inspiring. It was a lesson I would never forget. It's not easy to pinpoint exactly when things started feeling wrong that night, but looking back, I know it all went downhill when we found ourselves alone in that clearing. The sky was dark, but the moon was high and full, casting silver light across the trees and the river that ran nearby. The air was cool, and there was a slight chill that made me hug myself for warmth. My boyfriend, Luke, had talked me into this midnight hike through the park. He was an outdoors kind of guy, always looking for the next adventure. I wasn't so sure about it, but I figured, why not? We didn't get to spend enough time alone, and we'd been talking for weeks about having a night just to ourselves. The park was known for its hiking trails, and it wasn't uncommon to see people coming and going at all hours, even late at night. But at that moment, we were completely alone in the clearing. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional ripple of the river. Luke had suggested we take a break and sit at one of the picnic tables, which was strange considering how late it was, but I didn't mind. The night was peaceful, and the silence felt oddly comforting. There was something about being in the middle of nature that made everything feel raw and real. We sat across from each other at the table, enjoying the quiet, letting the moment stretch out. But that's when we started getting a little more playful. Luke, always the flirt, teased me and we started fooling around. I'm not going to pretend that we weren't having a good time, but I kept my eyes on the river, trying to keep things at least somewhat in control. The moonlight reflected off the water, giving it an almost ethereal glow, and for a moment, it made me forget about everything else. The worries, the tension, the strange vibe in the air. Luke was facing the dark tree line. I couldn't see much beyond the moonlit patches of ground scattered here and there, but I could feel the weight of the woods behind us. I don't know if it was the isolation or the eerie quiet, but the trees felt like they were pressing in. I brushed it off. After all, it's just nature, right? But then Luke went completely still. I noticed it before he said anything. His expression changed from relaxed to tense, his eyes fixed on the trees ahead of him. My stomach dropped, and I immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Luke's voice, low and measured, finally broke the silence. There's a man coming towards us. I didn't have to turn around to know what he was talking about. The air suddenly felt thicker, colder, as though something was intruding on our little bubble of isolation. My eyes locked on Luke's face, his jaw tight, his gaze now fixed to the figure slowly making its way towards us from the tree line. My heart began to pound, and I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was just some guy out for a walk? But why wasn't he saying anything? Why was he just walking straight towards us without a sound? I finally dared to look over my shoulder. The figure was still too far away to make out any details at first, but as he moved closer, I could make out the stark white of a t-shirt. His stride was fast, purposeful, and he wasn't veering off in another direction. He was coming directly towards us. At that moment, all rational thoughts flew out of my head. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I couldn't think. I just knew that I had to get out of there. I jumped up from the table, my legs shaking beneath me, adrenaline surging through my veins. Luke was right behind me, and I didn't look back, not even once. I ran without thinking, my heart thudding in my chest as I raced across the clearing and toward the path leading back to the main trail. I heard Luke's footsteps pounding behind me, matching my pace, but I couldn't stop to check if he was still with me. I had to get away. I knew he would catch up. I knew I wasn't alone in this, but my mind was still locked in a panic. The trees seemed to close in around me as I ran, and the moonlight was less forgiving now. The branches overhead blocked out most of the light, leaving me in a shroud of darkness. But I didn't slow down. I didn't dare look back, and my thoughts were consumed by one question. Who was that man, and what did he want? We made it to the main trail, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my breath ragged, my legs burning from the sudden sprint. I could hear Luke's footsteps pounding behind me, still keeping up. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the white t-shirt was still out there, still following us. I didn't know if he was close, or if we'd lost him, but the feeling of being pursued was overwhelming. It felt like we ran forever, but eventually, the sound of our footsteps began to feel more grounded, more like we were getting somewhere. The trail curved ahead, and we passed by several other hikers' campsites, their firelight flickering in the distance. There were no signs of anyone else on the trail, but at least I could see the light now. I forced myself to slow down, taking in the sounds of the night again. The trees no longer felt so suffocating, but I still couldn't shake the unease that lingered in my chest. Luke caught up to me, breathless but not panicked like I was. He grabbed my arm and stopped me for a moment. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but still tight with adrenaline. I nodded quickly, my heart racing too fast to form words. Yeah, I think so." We didn't stop there. We kept walking, slowly now, taking the trail at a more deliberate pace. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the man in the white t-shirt to appear out of nowhere, but there was nothing. The trail remained quiet, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of the leaves and the soft lapping of the river at a distance. It wasn't until we reached the park's entrance that I finally allowed myself to breathe properly again. We were back on the main road now, and there were a few cars parked near the entrance. Some people were packing up to leave after a day in the park, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I don't know if it was the fear, the adrenaline, or the fact that I still couldn't make sense of what had just happened, but everything felt off. Luke stopped walking and turned to face me. "We're okay now," he said, though his voice was still strained. He looked just as shaken as I felt, but he was trying to keep it together. I didn't respond at first. I was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of it. But in that moment, I knew I was never going back into that park at night again. Couldn't. The fear was too real. That man, whoever he was, had walked right up to us, not saying a word, just moving closer and closer with no indication of why he was there. It didn't make sense, and the fact that I couldn't understand it made it worse. I never learned who the man was, or why he had been walking straight towards us, but I know I'll never forget that night. Every time I think back to it, I still feel that knot in my stomach, that same sense of dread. Maybe it was just some guy out for a late-night stroll, but the way he walked, the way he didn't say a word, it still doesn't sit right with me. And that's why I'll never be down for midnight hikes again. The woods at night are full of unknowns, and sometimes those unknowns are better left unexplored. It was a cool autumn evening when I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The year was 2019, and I had just turned 24. My apartment was located on the edge of a quiet suburban town, and the stars were bright that night, the sky clear and vast. The small wooded area near my house always felt peaceful to me, even when the air started to grow crisp and the shadows long. The pond that sat nestled in those woods was a calming sight in the daytime, but it was something else entirely at night. I had always been fond of wandering at night. There was something about the quiet of the world when everyone else was asleep that gave me a sense of peace. I'd often find myself walking the same route, past the pond, through the woods, by the old bench and the rope swing that hung over the water. Some nights, I'd sit on the bench, lost in thought, looking up at the stars. The cool breeze always seemed to clear my mind, and for some reason, it felt like I could think better when the world was so still. On this particular evening, however, things would take an unexpected turn. As I made my way down the familiar path toward the bench, I noticed how eerily quiet the air felt. There wasn't a sound in the woods, not even the rustle of leaves. I shrugged it off. The wind was probably just light tonight, not enough to stir the branches. Still, there was a strange, unsettling stillness to the night. I reached the bench and sat down, glancing up at the sky. The moon was waxing, casting a soft, silvery glow over the trees. I took in a deep breath, trying to relax. It was rare for me to get out of the house, so I was determined to enjoy this moment. I kept my flashlight on me, not because I thought I'd need it, but just out of habit. It's always good to be prepared, I thought. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I heard it. A rustling sound coming from the trees to my right. My body stiffened, a cold prickling running down my spine. Bears weren't uncommon in this area, and I'd heard stories of them wandering too close to people's homes. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled out the flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just shadows and the movement of branches in the wind. My heart rate slowed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Bears could be stealthy, but that rustling had sounded too deliberate, too controlled. It wasn't just the wind. I kept my flashlight on the area, scanning the trees, though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, my nerves were on edge. I stayed on the bench, not wanting to move, but also not wanting to ignore the unsettling feeling that was creeping up on me. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was nothing out there. Minutes passed. The rustling had stopped, and the silence returned. I relaxed a bit, but I couldn't fully let go of the tension. My eyes were drawn to the woods, constantly checking the shadows. I tried to focus on the stars again, but my mind kept drifting back to that sound. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A slight movement in the tree. I froze, my gaze immediately snapping to the spot. There was something there, but it wasn't obvious at first. The branches of the tree were swaying gently, but the movement wasn't caused by the wind. Something was in the tree. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but the sight filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I didn't move. I just watched, my heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't sure whether to shine my flashlight on it. I didn't want to startle whatever it was. If it was an animal, it might come down. But the longer I stared, the more certain I was that it wasn't an animal. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the shape in the tree wasn't moving like an animal. It was moving in small, slow jerks, like someone trying to stay as still as possible. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my hand shaking. I couldn't bring myself to turn the light directly on it. I wasn't sure what I'd find, and part of me was terrified to know. For what felt like forever, I sat frozen, watching the shape, waiting for it to reveal itself. The rustling returned, but it was quieter now, almost as though the figure in the tree was trying to mimic the sound of the wind. And then, with a sudden, swift motion, the shape stopped moving. It hung there in the darkness, still and unnerving. I couldn't stand it any longer. The tension was suffocating, my mind racing, my thoughts scattered. Was it a person? An animal? A bear? My flashlight was still pointed toward the ground, but I could feel myself leaning toward it. I knew what I had to do. I turned the beam of the flashlight toward the tree, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, person, He was crouched on one of the upper branches of the tree, almost blending into the bark. He was naked, his body pale against the dark backdrop of the leaves. But what truly sent a wave of ice through my veins were his eyes. They were wide, unnaturally so, staring directly at me with a blank, hollow expression. I froze again, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam flickering across the tree as my heart raced. I was paralyzed. The man didn't move at first. He just stayed there, staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I don't know how long we sat like that, him staring at me too terrified to even breathe, but it felt like forever. The only sound was my pounding heartbeat. Finally, he shifted. Slowly, like a spider, he began to lower himself down the tree, moving with unnatural precision. My stomach lurched. I didn't know what to do. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. And then instinct kicked in. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care if he was coming down or if he was just watching me. I was already standing, already scrambling off the bench. My legs felt weak, but I didn't care. I was already running, pushing my body harder than it had ever gone before. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The night air bit at my skin as I bolted toward my house, my breath ragged, my thoughts a blur. I reached my backyard in record time, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I made sure every window was locked, every door secure. I even checked the attic just to be sure. The adrenaline kept me on edge for hours, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the image of his eyes from my mind. Even now, I can still feel the lingering sense of horror. I called the police immediately, but they didn't find anything. They said it was probably some prankster, but how could it be? A man in the trees, naked and watching? That wasn't a prank. Months passed, but the fear didn't go away. I started carrying a pocket knife when I walked, even during the day. And I didn't go out at night anymore unless I had someone with me. The woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt dangerous. Every rustling in the trees sent a jolt of panic through me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I don't think I'll ever forget those eyes. The way they stared at me, empty and unblinking. I don't know what could have happened if I hadn't run. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never take another walk in the woods alone at night. It was the middle of summer, the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and oppressive, the sun beating down relentlessly on everything in sight. I had been looking forward to this ride for days. My horse, Dusty, was a sturdy, reliable animal, a little older but still spry for his age. We had ridden together countless times through the hills and trails that snaked through the wooded area near our home. Today felt like a perfect day to head out alone, just the two of us, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. The trail I took was one I knew well, wide enough for Dusty's hooves to strike the dirt with a steady rhythm, the trees arching overhead like the ceiling of an old cathedral. It was quiet, the kind of silence you can only get deep in the woods, where the only sounds are the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. As I rode deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, the shade from the trees offering welcome relief from the heat. I had been riding for nearly an hour when I first heard it, a faint, delicate sound that seemed out of place. It wasn't the usual bird calls or the rustling of small creatures. It was a soft, tinkling noise, like glass tapping against itself. First, I didn't think much of it, but as we trotted along the path, the sound came again, a little louder this time. Tink, tink. It was clear now. It sounded like something was trapped in a glass bottle, the glass rattling gently with the movement of whatever was inside. I slowed Dusty, pulling him to a stop. I scanned the ground, trying to locate the source of the sound. There was a small clearing just ahead, and in the middle of it, half hidden by some underbrush, I saw it. A clear glass bottle partially buried in the dirt. The tinkling sound continued, though now it was quieter, muffled. Curiosity tugged at me. I nudged Dusty forward and dismounted, landing softly on the ground. I walked toward the bottle and knelt beside it, brushing away some leaves and dirt that had settled over it. Inside, I saw something small and brown, something struggling. A mouse. The little creature was trapped, its tiny body wedged inside the narrow neck of the bottle. It was frantic, scrabbling at the sides, but it couldn't free itself. My heart softened at the sight. It was such a simple thing, but I could feel the mouse's panic, its helplessness. I gently tipped the bottle to its side, watching as the mouse scrambled out and darted into the underbrush, free at last. I watched it go, feeling a brief, quiet sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. I took a deep breath, turning back to my horse. But as I did, I heard another sound, something even more unsettling. It was a faint whine, a low, pitiful sound, barely audible at first. It wasn't coming from the woods around me. No, this sound was too close. It was coming from behind me, just off the trail. I turned toward the noise, my heart skipping a beat. Dusty shifted his weight, clearly picking up on the tension. I listened again. There it was, another whine, followed by a soft bark. The sound wasn't aggressive or playful. It was the sound of an animal in distress. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find. Slowly, I turned and began to walk back down the trail, following the direction of the sound. Dusty, ever patient, followed behind me, his hooves making soft thuds against the dirt. The noise continued, but now it was clearer, more urgent. It wasn't just a dog whining. It sounded like a dog in pain. I whistled, just a short, sharp whistle, and the whine stopped, replaced by a bark. It was quiet, strained, as though the dog didn't have the energy to bark loudly. That single bark sent a jolt of unease through me. Whatever was out there needed help. I quickened my pace, moving through the trees with Dusty close behind. The forest seemed to close in around me as I followed the noise, my boots crunching through the underbrush. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the sounds were growing louder now. The barking had stopped, replaced by the occasional whimper. It was a sound I couldn't ignore, and then I saw it. A German Shorthair, its coat dusty and matted, lay near a small creek that cut through the trail. The dog was thin, its ribs visible through its fur, its eyes sunken and dull. It was barely moving. As I approached, I could see that its collar had become caught on a large, gnarled root that jutted out from the water's edge. The poor animal had clearly been trying to get out of the creek, but its collar was stuck fast. I reached the dog cautiously, kneeling beside it. It looked up at me with tired eyes, its body trembling, as if every movement was a struggle. I could tell the dog was beyond exhaustion. There was no doubt in my mind that it had been trapped here for days, maybe longer. The collar was thick, the metal rusted, but I could see the engraved tag still hanging from it. My hands trembled slightly as I reached down to examine the tag. It was a hunting dog, probably one of the best trained dogs out there. I had seen dogs like this before, fit, strong, meant to run for miles without tiring. But this one was barely clinging to life. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. I carefully tried to work the collar free from the root, but it was stuck tightly. I wasn't sure if I was doing more harm than good, but I couldn't leave the dog here to die alone in the woods. With a little more force, I finally managed to loosen the collar from the root. The dog let out a soft yelp, but it didn't resist. I slowly worked the collar off, and the dog, now free, let out a weak, relieved whimper. I rubbed its head gently, trying to offer comfort, though I wasn't sure how much good that would do. I stood up, looking around for some sign of where the dog had come from. There was no one else on the trail, no sign of anyone looking for it. I checked the collar again. There was a phone number etched into it. I pulled out my phone, dialing the number from the tag. My hands were shaking as I held the phone to my ear. The line rang for a few moments before someone picked up. "Hello." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Hi, I'm out here on the trail, and I found your dog. It's in pretty bad shape." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard a soft gasp. Where? Where did you find him?" I gave them directions, telling them I was near the creek and would stay with the dog until they arrived. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost in disbelief. The dog had been missing for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, I repeated, my mind reeling. The dog had been stuck in that creek for that long, with no one searching for him. It was a miracle he was still alive. The owner promised they would be on their way immediately. I stayed with the dog, talking softly to it, trying to keep it calm. As I knelt beside it, I couldn't help but wonder how the dog had gotten here. Why hadn't anyone found him sooner? Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car engine coming down the trail. A truck appeared around the bend, kicking up dust as it pulled up to where we were. The door opened, and a man in his mid-40s stepped out. His eyes were wide as he saw the dog lying there. Without a word, he rushed over to his dog, kneeling down beside it. The man gently ran his hands over the dog's body, checking for injuries. The dog, though weak, wagged its tail slightly, recognizing the familiar scent of its owner. I stood up and stepped back, giving them some space. The man looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved him. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't found him." I nodded, still processing everything that had happened. It wasn't just a simple encounter with a lost dog. It had been a moment where the difference between life and death was a matter of timing. The dog had been on the brink of dying alone in the woods, but somehow I had found him just in time. I watched as the man carefully loaded his dog into the back of the truck, making sure he was comfortable. "He'll be okay," the man said, looking at me one last time. "He's strong, and he's got a good heart." I gave a small smile, feeling a warmth in my chest. As the truck drove off, I stayed behind, watching until they disappeared from view. I hadn't expected anything like this when I set out on my ride, but as I looked back toward the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been in the right place at the right time. I climbed back onto Dusty, the weight of the day settling on me. The trail ahead of me seemed less ominous now, more like a reminder that even in the most unexpected moments, there are things worth saving, and sometimes that's all we can do. Save what we can when we can. I've never been the type of person to be afraid of walking alone, especially not after a long shift at work. I always felt like I was just a regular guy doing regular things, and nothing was going to change that. I'd worked at the same company for years, and my daily walks home after the late shifts were something I'd gotten used to. It was just part of my routine. Normally, I worked the afternoon shift, so I'd get off around 7 p.m. and would have just enough time to take the trail behind the train tracks, cut through a neighborhood, and get home in about 20 minutes. The whole route was quiet, calm, and felt safe to me. It was just one of those things you never think twice about when you're used to it. But this night was different. I had agreed to cover a half shift for a colleague. The plan was simple. I'd work the extra few hours and head home a bit later than usual. No big deal. I had done it before. What I didn't know was that, on this particular night, everything would change in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was just after 11 p.m. when I finally started the walk home. The sky was dark, and the usual noise of the street was replaced by the distant hum of traffic. It was late and the world felt different. Not in a supernatural way, but in that way where everything feels quieter and the shadows seem to stretch just a little longer than they should. I still took the same path I always did, the one that cut behind the train tracks and led me toward the quieter streets. The path itself was gravel and overgrown in places, but it was peaceful. You could see the outlines of trees and the occasional streetlight in the distance, but it was mostly dark. No one really used it at night, so it always felt isolated, but I liked it that way. It was away from the traffic, the noise, and the bustle of the main roads. Just me and the night. I'd walked this path hundreds of times before, and never once did I feel uneasy. That was until this night. I was nearing a bend in the trail when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just someone resting or maybe fixing their bike. But the closer I got, the more I realized something was off. There was a man lying beside a bicycle, groaning softly. The sound didn't match the scene, though. It wasn't a genuine cry for help, more like a dramatic, exaggerated moan, the kind a kid might make when they're trying to get out of going to school or something. It didn't sound real. It was more like a show. I stopped walking for a moment, unsure of what to do. He saw me standing there, and immediately, his head turned in my direction. His eyes locked onto mine, and he said, "Hey man, help me. I'm hurt." His voice was shaky, but still I wasn't buying it. His bike was upright, standing perfectly on its kickstand, like he had carefully placed it there. That's what didn't make sense to me. Why would someone who was supposedly in pain take the time to properly set up their bike? It just didn't add up. I took a step back, feeling a little uneasy. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he was laying there, or maybe it was just the way he was looking at me, but I had a gut feeling that I needed to get out of there. I turned around slowly, deciding to head back toward the street. The path I was on led toward the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the street, and I knew if I could make it over those tracks, I'd be back on familiar ground. Safe ground. Just as I started walking away, I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Hey!" The guy's voice rang out, louder this time, almost frantic. "You better stop. I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, half expecting to see him still lying there, but instead he was standing now. His hands were gripping his bike tightly, and his eyes were wild with a look I hadn't expected. "Shit," I muttered to myself, and that's when I ran. I had no idea what his intentions were, but I knew that if he was willing to threaten me like that, things were about to escalate. My feet were already moving before my brain could even process it. I bolted up the incline toward the railroad tracks, my legs pumping hard against the gravel. I didn't look back, but I could hear him behind me, the sound of his bike tires scraping against the trail, getting louder as he rushed toward me. I was almost at the tracks when I heard the sound of metal on gravel. There was a loud crash, followed by a sickening thud, and I knew instantly what had happened. I didn't stop running. I was over the tracks and almost back to the street before I even dared to look back. I had made it to the other side when I heard him. He was no longer shouting threats. Instead, he was groaning, and this time it sounded real. His voice had taken on a different tone, one that made my stomach turn. It was the kind of groan you make when you've really hurt yourself, not the fake kind. I hesitated for just a moment before I picked up my pace again and kept running. When I reached the main road, I stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was breathing heavily. I was almost back to the gas station I passed on my way to work, so I walked quickly toward it, my eyes darting nervously behind me as I went. I reached the payphone at the corner of the gas station and picked it up, dialing 911. My hands were shaking as I explained what had happened, my words coming out in a rush. The dispatcher asked me where I was, and I told them. They promised to send someone right away, and not long after, I saw the flashing lights of a squad car pulling up. The officer who got out of the car was calm, almost too calm for someone who'd just heard about a potential assault. I explained the situation to him, and he listened, his expression unreadable. "You said he threatened to kill you?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," I said, still out of breath. "He came after me. He was on his bike and said he was gonna kill me." The officer let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're lucky you got out of there. You're not the first one he's pulled this on. This guy's an idiot. He tries to rob people on that trail, and he always gets himself hurt." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "He's been doing this for a while. He'll pretend to be hurt or act like he needs help, and when someone stops, he tries to rob them. But he's not very good at it. He ends up crashing his bike every time." The officer chuckled again, shaking his head. "I swear we've had to pick his ass up more times than I can count. He's like a walking disaster." I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The guy who had just threatened to kill me had done this before, and he was known to the police for being an idiot who couldn't even rob someone properly? The officer seemed to find the whole thing pretty amusing. He took down my statement, told me to be careful, and assured me they would take care of it from there. I don't know why, but I felt a little better after that. It was good to know that I wasn't the first person this had happened to, and it wasn't as serious as I had thought at first. Still, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't made it to that gas station in time, things might have turned out very differently. The guy didn't get away with anything that night. He had been caught in his own little trap. And as for me, well, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the things that seem harmless in the light of day can turn into something completely different when the sun goes down. I walked home the rest of the way that night with my heart still pounding in my chest, but with a sense of relief that it was over. I never took that trail at night again. And while I didn't exactly feel afraid, I felt a lot more cautious. Like I had learned that some of the paths you walk on aren't always as safe as they seem. The world was different at night, and I was reminded of that in the most unsettling way possible. I was 16 when I went to Ridge Rock Leadership Camp. It was one of those week-long trips organized by our scout troop every summer. It wasn't the usual camp filled with canoeing and roasting marshmallows either. This was more serious. It was for scouts working toward higher ranks, the ones who were supposed to be learning responsibility and leadership. The idea was to put us in tougher situations, give us some challenges, and see how we handled them as a team. Ridge Rock wasn't even in a normal campground. It was a rugged area way up in the Sawtooth Mountains in central Idaho. Not many people knew about it unless they were part of the scouting world. We had to hike in nearly 4 miles from the nearest road, carrying all our gear, and we wouldn't see any other groups or rangers during the week. It was just us, the trees, and the wildlife. We arrived on a Sunday in late June. The weather was decent, sunny, a little cool in the mornings, but nothing out of the ordinary. My troop was made up of about 12 boys between 14 and 17, split into 4 small tents in our site. Our camp was on a ridge that overlooked a steep valley to the north, with heavy forest to the south and east. To the west, there was a rocky trail that led up toward a craggy hill called Bald Point. From up there, you could see across the valley and even catch a glimpse of the old ranger cabin a couple miles down the other side. We set up our tents in a circle around the campfire ring. Each tent had 3 guys in it. Mine was shared with Mark and Kyle, both 16 like me. We got along pretty well. The first few days were filled with the usual scout stuff: fire building, navigation training, basic survival skills, first aid drills. We also did group hikes every day, working with maps and compasses instead of GPS, learning how to lead each other and make decisions in the wilderness. It was hard work, but it was also fun. The evenings were cold, but we were tired enough that sleep came easy. On the 5th night, which was a Thursday, we hiked out to the northern edge of the valley and did an overnight solo shelter challenge. Each of us had to build a simple shelter and sleep apart from the others in a small radius, just close enough that a leader could check on us if needed. It was strange being alone like that in the woods, but nothing weird happened that night. The next morning, we packed up and returned to our base camp by mid-morning. We had breakfast, reorganized our gear, and got ready for the last full day of the camp. The plan was to do some team relay challenges in the afternoon, followed by a hike up to Bald Point before sunset. By the time we went to sleep that night, everything felt pretty normal. We were all sore, tired, and half sunburnt, but in that good way where you know you've worked hard. The weather had been great all day, and the air was still and cool that night. You could hear insects in the trees, the occasional rustling of branches, but no wind, no rain, no sign of anything unusual. That changed the next morning. It was just before dawn when I first heard it. A sharp, panicked voice calling out from somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it was someone dreaming or messing around, but then I heard it again, louder and more urgent. It was a camp staff member. Not one of the guys from my tent, but someone from one of the adult leader tents, maybe the head instructor. He wasn't shouting at us, exactly, but he was speaking loud and firm, telling everyone to stay inside their tents, not to come out for any reason. I sat up halfway in my sleeping bag, rubbed my eyes, and looked toward the front of the tent. The light outside was still dim, just that faint early morning gray that comes right before sunrise. I couldn't see much, but I could tell it wasn't raining. No thunder, no wind. So whatever the problem was, it wasn't weather. Mark mumbled something and turned over, but I didn't say anything. Kyle was breathing slow, probably still asleep. I laid back down, half thinking maybe it was a drill, or maybe they'd seen a bear near the camp. That happened sometimes in Idaho, but not often at Ridge Rock. Still, I didn't feel alarmed. If anything, I just felt tired again. I figured whatever it was, the adults would deal with it. So I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chest and tried to fall back asleep. That's when I noticed something. The air had changed. Not colder exactly, but heavier. Still. Too still. The kind of stillness you don't notice at first until you realize that every normal sound, every insect, every leaf twitch is just gone. It was dead silent outside. I opened my eyes again, listening. The forest was holding its breath. Not even birdsong, and the sun was probably just about to rise. That was the first time I felt uneasy. I didn't want to get up and unzip the flap. The leader had told us to stay inside, and that was all I needed to convince myself to stay put. But something in the silence made me sit up straighter. And that's when I saw them. At first, it was just a blur. Two large shapes slowly moving through the trees to the east side of the camp. I was looking through the mesh of the tent's front window, and the light outside had brightened just enough to show some contrast. These shapes were huge. They moved together, slow and careful. I couldn't hear them, but I could feel the weight of them. They passed behind one of the other tents, and I lost sight of them for a second. Then they came closer. I held my breath. The bigger one came around the side of our tent, maybe 20 feet away. I still couldn't make out exactly what it was through the tent window, but the shape was unmistakable. Tall, heavy, with long legs and a thick neck. The second one followed closely, smaller, but still big. First, I thought elk. But elk don't usually walk into camps like that. And then I saw the front legs, too long and lanky. The ears were broad and short, not pointed. Then I realized what it had to be. Moose, a cow and a calf. And they weren't just passing by. They were investigating. I froze. Everything in me told me to stay perfectly still, to not make a sound. The big one, the mother, walked straight toward our tent. Not quickly, just slowly, like she was curious. Her shadow stretched over the tent as she got closer. The light outside was growing, so the silhouette was clear. I could see the outline of her back and part of her head as she paused just a few feet away. Then she stepped even closer. Her massive head hovered over the tent's mesh window, and she sniffed. I didn't move a muscle. The sound of her breathing was low and wet, deep, like the slow dragging wind from a train tunnel. Then her nose pressed into the fabric of the tent, and I saw it. A wide, round impression, easily the size of my entire torso, slowly pushed into the side of the tent just inches from where I was sitting. The nylon groaned a little, stretching inward. She sniffed again. I could smell her. A sharp mix of wet fur, old mud, and sour plants. I stayed perfectly still, watching that imprint hover there for several seconds, until finally it pulled back. The shadow moved to the side, and a moment later, I saw her shape drifting away to rejoin the smaller one. They turned and walked back into the trees without a sound, vanishing into the thinning morning light. I sat there, still silent, still stiff, barely breathing. It was at least 5 full minutes before I even moved. I couldn't hear anything else outside, and I didn't see any more shadows. Eventually, I heard some distant movement, low voices, cautious footsteps, and figured one of the staff must have seen them leave. Later that morning, when the camp woke up and people came out of their tents, everyone was talking. One of the instructors had spotted the moose early that morning and quickly went tent to tent alerting the adults. They'd seen the pair enter the edge of the camp, probably wandering in from the valley trail to the east. Nobody knew what drew them in. Maybe the smell of food, or maybe they were just curious. But everyone agreed we were lucky. A cow moose with a calf can be extremely dangerous if she feels threatened. There had been no damage, no injuries. Just a few messed up footprints and the memory of that moment when something the size of a small car leaned into our tent. We finished the camp without any more surprises. The hike up Bald Point that evening felt different than it would have before. I kept looking over my shoulder, wondering if something would appear again in the trees. But the forest had returned to normal. The wind came back, the birds chirped, the quiet had passed. When we left Ridge Rock the next day, I remember hiking back out through the same eastern trail and glancing at the spots near camp where I thought the moose might have stood. It looked ordinary. Trees, grass, a few old logs. But that silence, that smell, and that slow, heavy breath, it stuck with me. I never forgot how it felt to be just a thin layer of nylon away from something so massive and wild. Something that could have crushed our tent if it had wanted to. And I never forgot how helpless I felt in that moment. Not scared like in a movie, but quietly aware of how small I really was in the grand scheme of things. It was the last time I ever slept that soundly in a tent. And I never used, "Oh, it's probably nothing," as an excuse to go back to sleep again. It was a late August night when my friends and I decided to head out on a hike. We were all about 16 years old, living in a small town in Oregon, and we were hungry for adventure. The summer had dragged on, and school was about to start again, so we wanted to make the most of the last few days of freedom. I'm Kyle, and my best friend, Evan, was always the one pushing for the wild ideas. This time, it was his suggestion. Hike to the top of Mt. Tilton to catch the meteor shower that was supposed to peak that night. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. Evan, me, our two friends Sam and Lisa, and we were all in. It was already 10 p.m. when we piled into Evan's beat-up truck, ready to climb the mountain. I remember thinking it was a bit late to start a hike, but Evan always convinced me to go along with his ideas. I wasn't nervous. It was just supposed to be a fun night with friends, nothing special. Mt. Tilton wasn't a big mountain, only about 2,500 feet at its peak, but it had a reputation for being pretty quiet, especially at night. The trails were well maintained, though they got steeper the higher you went. A few folks came here to hike during the day, but at night it felt like the mountain belonged to just a handful of people. We didn't expect to run into anyone, and we were sure we wouldn't have to worry about other hikers. It was a good spot to see the meteors in the sky, away from city lights. By the time we parked the truck at the trailhead and started walking, the night was pitch black. There was a thin sliver of moonlight, but it didn't do much to light our way. The only sounds we could hear were the crunch of gravel beneath our boots and the rustling of trees as the wind moved through the branches. It wasn't cold, but it was definitely brisk. We had our jackets on, all of us chatting and joking as we made our way up the trail. We were all feeling pretty good at the start, laughing and sharing stories. Lisa, the only girl in our group, was walking ahead of the rest of us, her flashlight bobbing in the distance. Sam and Evan were arguing about something silly, while I walked a little behind, just watching the stars overhead. I wasn't paying much attention to the surroundings, lost in my thoughts. That's when I first noticed him, just standing off the trail, near the trees. A man, dressed in a black business suit. It didn't make sense. He was completely out of place on that mountain, especially in the dark. He wasn't even carrying a backpack, which was strange because the rest of us had brought water and snacks. I didn't say anything at first, thinking I had just imagined it. But the others noticed too. Evan was the first to speak up. "Did you guys see that guy?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, squinting into the darkness. "What's he doing here?" He stood there, still as a statue, his back to us. It was odd. We all slowed down instinctively. Sam and Lisa exchanged worried glances, but no one said anything. We just kept walking, but we picked up the pace. By the time we reached a small clearing, about halfway up the mountain, we stopped to catch our breath and get some water. I was already starting to feel the unease creeping in, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just some random guy out for a late-night walk, right? But then I saw him again, this time a little closer, walking steadily behind us. His footsteps were quieter than they should have been, too quiet for someone in dress shoes on rough terrain. "Guys, he's following us," Sam muttered under his breath. His voice was tight, like he was trying to pretend it didn't matter, but we all felt it. The same odd sense of discomfort creeping into our bones. I didn't know what to do. We were already halfway up the mountain, and turning back now seemed foolish. We didn't want to look like we were scared of some random guy, but it felt wrong. And the way he was walking, the way he was following us without saying a word, it didn't sit right. "What should we do?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. I could tell she was freaked out. "We should keep going," Evan said, trying to sound confident. "Just ignore him." So we did. We kept walking, picking up the pace. We didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing us scared. But by the time we reached another spot to stop, he was even closer. no more than 10 feet behind us. At this point, I wasn't sure if we should confront him or keep walking, but something told me that if we stopped again, it might get worse. "Let's just ask him what he's doing," I suggested finally. Evan looked over at me. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Yeah, let's see if he's just out for a walk or if he's following us on purpose." Reluctantly, we stopped and waited for the man to catch up. I remember feeling my heart pounding in my chest, like it was about to burst. He wasn't wearing any hiking gear, just that dark suit and shoes that clearly weren't made for a trail. When he reached us, he just stopped and stared for a moment like he was sizing us up. Then he spoke, his voice eerily calm, even though we could tell he was a little out of breath. "Are you here for the meteor shower?" he asked. His words were soft, but they had a weight to them. It was strange. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, we're just heading to the top." He didn't smile back. He just stood there, looking at each of us one by one. Then, without waiting for an invitation, he asked if he could join us. His voice was too polite, too deliberate. "Can I walk with you guys?" he asked. We didn't know how to respond. There was no reason to say no, but everything about this situation felt wrong. It wasn't normal for a man in his 30s to be on a remote mountain trail at night with a group of teenagers, especially dressed in a business suit. But what could we do? We couldn't just tell him to leave without sounding rude or like we were scared. So we let him join us, though none of us were comfortable with it. The whole time, I could feel his eyes lingering on Lisa. It was subtle, but it was there, like he was watching her a little too closely. And then he started walking closer to her, so close that I could see the way he tilted his head and sniffed the air like he could smell her shampoo. I was ready to tell him to back off, but I didn't. We reached the top of the mountain around 1:30 a.m., and we sat down on the cold rock to watch the stars. I could feel the tension building in the air. The man sat next to Lisa, so close that it felt like he was leaning in too much, invading her space. Lisa's eyes kept darting to the side, and I could see her body language tensing. She was uncomfortable, and I couldn't blame her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly and said, "We should head back down. It's getting late." Lisa shot me a thankful look, and without another word, we all started moving again. But as we turned to leave, I saw the man standing up as well. He didn't say anything. He just started walking behind us, staying closer to Lisa than anyone else. His pace was steady, almost too calm. When we reached the bottom of the mountain, I felt a sense of relief. But as we neared the parking lot, something stopped me dead in my tracks. "He's still following us," Evan said, his voice shaking. I looked over my shoulder. The man wasn't far behind, but now he was running, full-on sprinting down the trail, holding a large stick in his hand. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, faster. We ran, all four of us. We didn't look back. We didn't say anything. We just booked it. Our hearts were pounding in our chests, adrenaline flooding our veins. We got to the car, jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and sped off without a second thought. We didn't talk much on the drive home. We were all too shaken, too scared to put it into words. But we thought we were done with it. We thought we had ditched him, and that would be the end of the story. 2 days later, we got a text from Lisa. It was a link to a news article. A man murdered his wife and another girl on a trail near Mt. Tilton last night. Police are looking for him. The article included a description of the man we had encountered, exactly the same as the guy who had followed us up the mountain. The same man we'd seen sprinting down the trail with a stick. He had killed 2 people that night, one of them a girl hiking on the same trail we had just hiked. We never went back to Mt. Tilton after that. We never spoke to our parents about what happened. We never told anyone about the man we met. But we all knew one thing for sure. We had gotten out of there just in time. And we never again went hiking at night. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take my dad on a camping trip in the remote woods of northern Idaho. We hadn't been on a hiking trip together in years, and I thought it would be a good way to reconnect. The campground was small and isolated, nestled right along the edge of a quiet lake. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the gentle sounds of nature, and maybe the occasional distant crackle of firewood. We arrived at the site around mid-afternoon, setting up our tent near the water's edge. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine trees, and the sky above was the perfect shade of blue, like something out of a painting. We'd packed light, just the essentials, knowing we were only going to be out for a couple of days. We had our gear ready for a hike to a waterfall hidden deep in the forest. It was a bit of a trek, but the trail was well marked, and my dad had hiked it before. After we set up camp, we decided to go for an afternoon hike, just the two of us. The plan was to follow the path along the lake and head toward the waterfall. It wasn't a long hike, but it would take a few hours, so we made sure to bring enough water and snacks. We crossed the lake's shoreline, heading into the thick forest, with the sound of leaves crunching under our boots. The trees were dense here, casting long shadows even though it was still early in the afternoon. I had always loved being in the woods. It felt like a different world, one where everything was quiet and still, a place to get lost in thought. My dad, a man who had spent most of his youth exploring these kinds of forests, led the way. He was in his late 50s by this time, but he still moved with the agility of someone much younger. I had always admired his strength and endurance. As we walked deeper into the forest, I noticed something odd about the air. It felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were watching us. My dad didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the time of day. It was getting close to dusk, and the shadows in the trees were growing longer, more pronounced. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, focusing on the sound of my footsteps and the occasional call of birds overhead. We made our way through the trees, the lake now far behind us. The path was narrow, winding between thick bushes and towering pines. Eventually, we came across a small clearing, where the trees seemed to open up slightly. The ground was soft with moss and leaves, and the air smelled like damp earth. "I'm going to take a quick leak," my dad said, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't wait for a response before stepping off the trail and into the trees. I nodded, turning away from him, and found a spot on the opposite side of the clearing to stand. It was quiet again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, clear and calm. "I'm over here." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it was unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just my dad calling out to me, but when I turned around, he was still facing the other direction, his back turned. The voice hadn't come from him. It sounded like it came from somewhere just off the trail, but there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat, and I called out, "Dad, did you hear that?" He paused and turned to face me, his expression confused. "Hear what?" "That voice," I said. "It sounded like a kid. It came from over there." I pointed in the direction where the voice had come from. He shook his head. "You sure it wasn't you?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "No, it wasn't me. It sounded like a kid. Maybe someone's lost." We both went quiet, listening, but all we heard was the wind rustling the trees and the occasional bird call. The voice hadn't been loud, but it had been clear enough for both of us to hear. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Maybe it was just an echo," I suggested, trying to calm myself, but my dad didn't look convinced. He frowned, looking around the clearing as if expecting to see someone step out from behind the trees. "I don't like this. Let's check it out." We both started walking toward the area where the voice had come from, but there was no one there. We looked for a long time, checking the surrounding trees, the bushes, even the ground. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone having passed through recently. We even shouted a few times, hoping someone would answer, but there was nothing. After a while, we gave up and decided to head back. Neither of us spoke much as we retraced our steps, but the unsettling feeling didn't fade. The voice we'd heard lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I kept thinking about it, replaying it over and over in my head, but the woods were silent now, too silent. As we made our way back toward the trail, we both began to hear it, the sound of twigs snapping behind us. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sounds were too deliberate, too consistent. Whatever it was following us, moving in time with our footsteps. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up my spine. It's probably just an animal, I told myself, but the more I listened, the more it felt like something or someone was stalking us. I glanced over at my dad. His face was set, his eyes scanning the woods around us, his hand hovering near his backpack as if ready to grab a weapon at any moment. The sounds didn't stop. They grew louder as we walked, the rustling of bushes just out of sight, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. It wasn't the wind. I was sure of that. There was something moving through the trees with us. We picked up the pace, our footsteps growing more hurried as the sounds drew closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. It wasn't just the sound of twigs breaking anymore. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the faint sound of breathing. I wanted to turn around, to see what was behind us, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was afraid that if I looked, I'd see something I wasn't ready to face. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could almost feel the presence behind us, close enough that I could almost reach out and touch it. We didn't stop. We kept moving, faster now, my dad leading the way with determination in his steps. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the path ahead, but I could hear it, feel it, closing in. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. When we finally reached the edge of the clearing, the sound stopped. Dead silence. My dad didn't say anything, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We both turned to look behind us, but there was nothing there. No animal, no movement, just the shadows of the trees stretching long into the dusk. We didn't talk about it much after that. We just kept walking, pushing through the trees toward camp, the weight of whatever had followed us hanging heavy between us. By the time we reached our campsite, the last light of day was fading, and the forest felt a little less inviting. We didn't stay out any longer than we needed to. The firelight flickered between us as we ate our dinner in silence, the unease still hanging in the air. We never did make it to the waterfall, and to this day, I can't explain what happened that afternoon. The voice, the sounds following us. It's something I can't shake. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a lost hiker. It was something else, something I still can't put into words. We packed up the next day and left earlier than planned, and we haven't camped in those woods since. There's a part of me that knows we weren't alone that day, but I'll never fully understand what it was. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. It was late March of 2019 when it happened. I was 22 at the time, living alone in a small town called Maple Hollow, in Indiana. It wasn't the kind of town you hear about on the news or see in movies. Just one of those places with quiet streets, a single grocery store, a gas station that closed early, and neighborhoods full of the same old houses built in the 70s and 80s. I had lived there for a little over a year by then, renting a small second-story apartment on the south side of town, not far from the edge of the woods. Back then, I had this habit of going on walks late at night. It wasn't about fitness or anything productive. I just enjoyed the calm that came with those early morning hours. The world seemed to pause, and the roads felt like they belonged only to me. I'd put on some comfortable shoes, throw on a hoodie, and walk the quiet streets with just the sound of my footsteps and the occasional gust of wind. It was how I cleared my head. That night started the same way any of them did. I was restless, lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone with the lights off. The clock on the wall ticked past 1:30 a.m., and I figured I might as well head out. It was chilly but not freezing, one of those nights where you could see your breath, but your hands wouldn't go numb. I grabbed my keys, slid my phone into my pocket, and stepped outside. The town was as still as ever. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the only movement came from the occasional flicker of porch lights or the rustling of wind through the bare branches overhead. I started walking east, heading down Cedar Avenue, which ran through the middle of town. I didn't have a route planned, I never really did. I just walked where my feet took me. About half an hour in, I looped around the post office and started heading back the way I came. That was when I first saw the van. It was black and boxy, the kind you don't see much anymore unless someone's using it for work. It turned onto Cedar about a block ahead of me and slowly drove past. Not speeding or anything, just kind of crawling along. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't unusual for someone to be out late, and sometimes people were just out for a drive. But then I saw it again. Maybe 5 minutes later, I had just passed the community park when it came down the street once more, this time from the opposite direction. That's when my stomach dropped a little. The shape was the same, and so was the way it moved, slow and deliberate. I squinted as it passed and noticed something odd. It didn't have any license plates. Now I was on edge. I tried to tell myself maybe I was just seeing things, that maybe the plates were dirty or the angle made it hard to see. But even with that thought in my head, I felt something tighten in my chest. I kept walking, but I picked up the pace. My footsteps grew sharper, more alert. I kept checking over my shoulder every few seconds, and my ears strained to hear anything other than my own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. About 10 minutes passed. I took a right on Maple Street, heading toward the part of town with slightly newer homes. That's when the van came back again. It was unmistakable this time. Same black van, same slow speed, still no plates, but this time it stopped. It pulled ahead of me and came to a halt maybe 4 houses down. Just parked there, engine still running. No one got out. The headlights stayed on, casting a dull yellow glow across the pavement. I froze. My mind started racing. There were a dozen explanations that tried to push their way in: deliveries someone lost, maybe a construction worker heading to a job site early. But none of them made sense. Not at this hour. Not without plates. Not after circling me 3 times. I turned around. I didn't run, not yet. I didn't want to make it obvious. I just started walking the other way, fast and with purpose. I took a few turns, cutting down a side street, then another, trying to make it harder to follow me if they were trying. The houses got older again, a few with overgrown yards or busted porch steps. The kind of homes that looked like no one would answer if you knocked. After another minute or two, I risked a glance behind me. The van wasn't there. I thought maybe I lost them, but I wasn't ready to trust that. I took another right and ducked through the side yard of a house I didn't recognize. The gate creaked a little as I opened it, but I moved quickly, heading behind the wooden fence that separated the property from the next one. I crouched down and waited. The street was quiet. I stayed still, trying to control my breathing. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The cold from the ground seeped into my legs as I crouched in the dirt, but I didn't dare move. Then I heard it, that low engine hum. It was faint, but it was there. A second later, headlights swept across the road, then the fence I was hiding behind. The black van crawled past the yard like a shark in the water. It didn't stop this time, just kept going slowly like it was scanning the sidewalks. I didn't move, kept going. Eventually, the sound of the engine faded until it was gone. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Still nothing. I stayed crouched behind that fence for maybe 25 minutes total, waiting for any sound, any sign that it was coming back. I listened for footsteps, for doors, for tires on gravel, but it stayed quiet. When I finally stood up, my legs were stiff. My back hurt, but I didn't care. I crept out of the yard, careful not to make any noise. I took a few more back roads, crossing through another neighborhood, then through the back of a small public garden until I finally reached my street. I didn't go through the front door. Instead, I went around the back of my apartment building, pulled the trash bin close to the wall, and climbed up to the fire escape. I took the stairs 2 at a time until I reached my window. I had left it unlocked like I always did. I slid it open and crawled in, barely making a sound. Once I was inside, I locked it and pulled the blinds shut. I didn't even take my shoes off. I just collapsed onto the floor, heart still racing. I stayed there for a long time. Eventually, I got up and checked every window, every door, making sure everything was locked. I turned off all the lights, pulled the curtains tight, and sat in the dark, listening. But nothing happened. No knock on the door, no headlights outside, no engine hum. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I debated calling the police. But what would I even say? I didn't have a plate number. I didn't see the driver. Nothing actually happened. They circled me a few times, and yeah, it was creepy as hell, but it wasn't a crime. I never reported it. I didn't tell anyone either, but I stopped going on late-night walks after that. For the next few weeks, every time I heard a vehicle outside at night, I'd check through the blinds. I even parked my car a few blocks away just in case. I started carrying a knife in my pocket whenever I went out, even during the day. I installed a new deadbolt and put a stick in the window frame. Nothing ever came of it. The van never showed up again. I never saw it during the day. No one else I talked to later had seen anything strange that week either. Still, something about that night stayed with me. Not just the fear, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. It changed the way I saw the town. I used to think of it as quiet and peaceful, safe even, but after that, every alley felt darker. Every parked car felt like a threat, and every shadow looked like it could hold someone waiting. And maybe that was the scariest part. Not knowing what they wanted. Not knowing what would have happened if I hadn't turned around when I did. Not knowing if they were still out there, maybe following someone else now. Someone who didn't notice soon enough. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm driving home late or I see a van with no plates, that same cold feeling returns, like a warning. I trust it now, because whatever they wanted that night, I don't think it was good. And I was lucky to walk away. When I was about 20 years old, back in the fall of 2003, I was in my second year of college in a small town in western North Carolina. I was studying environmental science at a university tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The campus was surrounded by dense woods, and you couldn't go 5 miles in any direction without hitting a trailhead or a dirt road that led to some forgotten part of the forest. It was heaven for anyone who loved being outdoors. I was young, overconfident, and just starting to figure out who I was. But I already knew I loved the woods, especially at night. Something about being alone in the quiet dark always appealed to me, like I could hear myself think more clearly than anywhere else. My group of friends and I used to go hiking all the time, sometimes during the day, but a lot of the time at night. We'd pick an easy trail, bring along a couple of flashlights, sometimes a joint or two, and just walk and talk and listen to the sounds around us. By that point, I'd gotten really familiar with the local trails. I knew which ones looped, which ones dead-ended, and which ones you could do in your sleep. I didn't think twice about going off on my own either. I'd done it plenty of times before. The forest was like a second home to me. That kind of familiarity makes you feel safe even when maybe you shouldn't. That October, I remember we'd had a streak of clear nights and mild weather. One of those rare times when the mountain air was crisp but not freezing, and everything smelled like leaves and pine. The moon had been full for a couple nights in a row, so the woods were bright in that eerie, silvery way that makes it feel like twilight instead of full dark. You could see your own shadow on the trail in front of you. It made the forest look like something out of a painting, blue shadows, silver highlights, every tree branch outlined perfectly. It was a Thursday night, maybe around 10:30 or so, and I was a little bit stoned after hanging out with my roommate. He'd fallen asleep watching a movie, and I was wide awake, feeling restless. I'd had a stressful week of midterms and labs, and something about the night just felt too perfect to waste. I grabbed my flashlight from my desk drawer and pulled on a hoodie and my boots. No phone, of course. None of us had smartphones back then, and even regular cells didn't get any reception out there. I drove about 15 minutes out of town to a trailhead I knew well. It wasn't part of a national park or anything, just an old loop trail off a gravel road that locals used sometimes. It didn't even have a sign anymore, just a metal post half rusted out of the ground. The trail was maybe a mile and change all the way around, flat for the most part, with a few gentle rises but nothing serious. The kind of trail you could walk half asleep and still find your way back, as long as you stayed on it. I parked in a little gravel turnout near the start, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet. The woods were dead still except for the sound of a few crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The moon was nearly straight overhead, lighting up everything so well that I didn't even turn on my flashlight. I just stuffed it in the kangaroo pocket of my hoodie and started walking. The first, it was everything I'd hoped for. The leaves had started to fall, and the ground was soft with them, muffling my footsteps. The trees towered overhead, their branches casting long fingers of shadow across the trail. I walked slowly, breathing in that cool night air, just listening and thinking. Every once in a while, a breeze would move through the trees, shaking down a few more leaves, and I'd stop to watch them drift through the light. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how lucky I was to live in a place like that. About halfway through the loop, there was a fork that led off into an overgrown trail that hadn't been maintained in years. I knew better than to take it, especially alone at night, so I kept to the main loop. That's when I started feeling it. An unease, like my stomach had dropped a little. At first, I thought it was just the weed catching up to me, or maybe just my mind playing tricks. I paused, scanned the trees, and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes before. I shook it off and kept walking. Then I heard it. Started off faint, so soft I wasn't even sure if it was real. But within a few seconds, I knew. It was a man's voice crying. Not just sniffling or muttering, but full-on sobbing, carried on the wind from somewhere off to the right of the trail, deeper in the woods. He wasn't close, maybe a couple 100 feet off, but his voice carried clear in the stillness. He sounded wrecked, the kind of crying that comes from deep inside, when something has broken in you. But there was something else too. The sounds he made weren't just sadness, they were fractured, like he was talking to someone or to himself between sobs. The words didn't make any sense. It was more like gibberish, fast and jumbled, mixed in with these horrible hiccuping gasps. My first instinct should have been to help, but I froze. There was something wrong about the sound, something that hit me on a level I can't explain. It wasn't just fear. It was a kind of dread that made my skin crawl and my mouth go dry. My heart started pounding. I had the urge to call out, but before I could even part my lips, my body locked up. It was like every part of me knew better than to make a sound. I just stood there, staring into the trees, trying to make out a shape or a movement. But I couldn't see anything, just shadows. The crying went on, loud and raw, and I stood as still as I could. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. But eventually I started moving again. I turned around, as slowly and quietly as I could, and retraced my steps. I didn't run. I didn't want to make any noise at all. Every step I took, I placed my foot carefully to avoid leaves or branches. My whole body was tense, like if I even coughed, something terrible would happen. The crying kept going behind me, and I swear it felt like it followed me, echoing through the trees. My ears were locked on that sound, tunnel hearing, like it was the only thing in the world. I couldn't hear my own footsteps, couldn't hear the breeze anymore, just that crying. The further I got, the quieter it became, but it didn't stop. It just faded little by little until it was like it had never been there at all. When I finally saw the reflection of my car's headlights from the moonlight bouncing off the chrome, I nearly broke into a run. I kept it together until I got the driver's side door open and slammed it shut behind me. I locked all the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the engine, turned on the headlights, and drove back to campus like I was being chased. It wasn't until I parked in the student lot back at school that I realized how badly I was shaking. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. The crying sound was still in my head, looping, stuck like a splinter in my brain. I couldn't stop hearing it. It was the most human and the most broken thing I'd ever heard. I felt like I'd walked right up to the edge of something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time, partly because I knew how it would sound, and partly because I didn't want to relive it. I knew people would say it was just the weed or that I imagined it, but I didn't. I know what I heard. I wasn't high enough to hallucinate, and I hadn't been drinking. I was fully there. For weeks after, I avoided night hikes. Even during the day, I didn't go back to that trail. I couldn't bring myself to. I never reported it either. What would I say? That there was a crying man in the woods who sounded off? That I left him out there? I don't feel guilty. I've never felt guilty about leaving him behind, if he was even real. I know in my gut that I was in danger that night. That voice, that crying, wasn't just someone in pain. It felt like bait, like if I'd called out, if I'd moved toward it instead of away, something bad would have happened. I think the moonlight saved me that night. If it had been a darker night, if I'd needed to use my flashlight even once, I don't think I'd have made it back to my car without being seen. I never went hiking alone at night again after that. It changed something in me. I still love the woods. I still spend time outside. But I keep my hikes to daylight now, and I stay on the beaten path. Because sometimes, no matter how well you know a place, you never really know what's out there. And some things you don't want to know. Ever since that night, I can still see that trail in my mind. The bend where I stopped. The patch of woods where the sound came from. I've thought about going back just to prove to myself it was all in my head. But I never do. Because deep down, I don't think it was. I think there was someone or something out there that night, and I think they were waiting for me to speak. I'm not sure what made me start hiking at night. I guess it was just the quiet. Less people, less noise. The woods that surrounded the edges of my town, Wilkins, Indiana, weren't anything special to most folks. Just a patch of thick trees, mostly old oaks and some pines, spread out across hills and creeks and dead-end trails. But for me, they were a sort of refuge, a place I could go when the rest of the world felt too loud. By the time I turned 27, I had probably walked every trail, every clearing, and every deer path in that whole stretch of woods. At some point, I started doing it late at night, sometimes staying out so long I'd catch the sunrise breaking through the trees before heading home. I usually carried a small pack, water, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a snack or two. I didn't do anything risky. I stuck to the areas I knew, didn't wander too far from trails, and always let my brother know when I was heading out. He didn't like the idea of me being out there at night, but he knew it was just something I did. He figured it was better that I told him than not. That night, I think it was early spring, probably around late March 2021. I left around 11:30 p.m. I had worked a long shift, and I needed to clear my head. The air was still cold, not winter cold, but enough to see your breath. I parked near the southern entrance to the woods, a gravel lot that could fit about 4 or 5 cars. No one else was there. I strapped on my small pack, double-checked my flashlight, and headed into the trees. I had a usual loop I liked to take, a rough 6-mile circle that cut through some of the denser woods and ended at a small overlook that faced east. Great place to see the sunrise. The hike was quiet as usual. I saw a few raccoons and maybe a possum scurry off into the brush. Heard an owl somewhere off to my left for a while. But mostly it was just me and my boots on the trail. It wasn't until about 2:15 a.m. that things got strange. I had just passed a familiar fork in the trail. Left led toward the overlook. Right veered deeper into the woods toward an old, overgrown ATV path that hadn't been maintained in years. I normally went left, but something made me stop. I saw a dull, orange glow through the trees, far off in the distance to the right. It wasn't lightning or any natural kind of glow. It looked like firelight. A campfire, maybe. I don't know why, but I decided to check it out. It wasn't exactly normal to see anyone else out this deep at this hour, let alone someone building a fire in an area with no clearings or marked campsites. I figured maybe some kids had snuck out and built a fire to drink around or something, and I didn't want to stumble across that when they were already drunk and jumpy. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail and followed the faint glow. It took maybe 10 minutes of weaving through underbrush, moving around trees and fallen limbs. As I got closer, the glow became steadier, more defined. I could make out the flicker of a flame reflecting off something, metal maybe. When I finally got close enough to see what was really there, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a kind of shanty town. That's the only way I could think to describe it. Maybe a dozen or so crude little shelters, each made from whatever someone could find. Rusty scrap metal, sheets of plastic, bed sheets, old plywood, pallets, and even road signs. Some leaned into each other, others were freestanding. There were buckets and random furniture pieces scattered around. Chairs with no legs, milk crates, an old couch with its stuffing falling out. In the center of this strange little village was a fire pit, if you could call it that. It was a hollowed-out tire, blackened and burnt, filled with some kind of smoldering material that gave off steady flames. The fire wasn't dying down or flaring up. It just burned there steadily, quietly, like it had been maintained not long before I arrived. But there was no one there, not a single person. No movement, no voices, no footsteps, no sounds except for the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Everything else was dead quiet, and that was the part that really unsettled me. Not the makeshift buildings, not the odd fire pit, but the fact that this little camp looked like it had been lived in and then just abandoned. Quickly, there were sleeping bags inside some of the huts, a backpack, a half-eaten can of beans sitting on a stump. Someone had hung a line between two trees with clothes on it, pants, a shirt, even a sock or two. Someone had made this place home, or at least a stopover. And yet they were gone. All of them. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, just looking around, trying to understand what I was seeing. My instincts weren't screaming at me to run, but I felt this heavy pressure in my chest, like something wasn't right. Not dangerous exactly, but definitely off. I walked slowly around the outskirts of the shanty town, careful not to step on anything or make too much noise. I kept waiting to see someone step out of a shelter, or to hear a voice, or for a dog to bark, but nothing ever came. I did one full circle around the place and stopped near the fire pit again. That's when I noticed the footprints, dozens of them in the dirt, boots mostly, a few barefoot impressions, even a child-sized pair. They went in all directions. Some led toward the huts, some into the woods, others just meandered around the clearing like people had been pacing or gathering. But there were no fresh tracks, nothing recent. The prints were smudged and half-faded, like they'd been made hours ago. And the fire, that damn fire, it was still going. That meant someone had been here not long ago. Had to be. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either. I backed out the way I came, moving fast but careful. I didn't want to make noise. I don't know why, just didn't feel right to. I got back to the trail, took the left path this time, and made it to the overlook by around 3 a.m. The sky had started to lighten just a little in the east. I sat there, staring out, thinking about what I had seen. By the time the sun fully rose and painted the tops of the trees in gold, I had decided not to tell anyone about it. Not right away. I didn't want people snooping around out there. I didn't want some teenager getting curious and stepping into something they didn't understand. I kept it to myself for almost a month. Then one day I went back, this time in daylight. Around noon, I followed the same path, passed the same fork, took the same detour into the brush. I moved a little slower this time, not sure what I expected to find. But when I reached the clearing, the shanty town was gone. Every single thing gone. The shelters, the clothesline, the fire pit, the furniture, everything. The ground was still a little dark where the tire fire had been, and you could still see faint impressions in the dirt where some of the huts had stood. But it was like someone had packed up and carried it all out. No trash, no pieces left behind, no footprints. Clean, too clean. I walked the entire area, checked the tree line, looked for fresh trails. Nothing. It was like the place had never been there. If I hadn't seen it myself, I would have sworn it was just a weird dream. But it wasn't. I remembered every detail. The way the fire smelled, the color of the sheets hanging from the huts, the shape of the footprints in the dirt. After that, I stopped hiking at night. Not because I was scared, but because I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who were they? Why were they there? Why did they leave so suddenly? And how did they do it so fast, without a single trace? A few months later, I heard that someone else had seen lights in the woods late at night. Some hunter passing through. He didn't stop to check it out. Said it creeped him out. Said it looked like people were moving around in a circle. That's all he said. I never saw it again. Never saw any sign of that place. But sometimes on early mornings when the wind is still and I'm walking one of the easier trails with coffee in hand, I think about that fire burning in the middle of the woods with no one around. And I wonder just how many things like that happen out here without anyone ever knowing. I haven't stopped hiking, but I haven't gone off trail since. Not once, and I don't plan to. I was 26 when I heard about the old mansion tucked away in the forest outside of Oak Ridge, Oregon. It was 2013, and back then I used to hike a lot more than I do now. I wasn't into camping or long trips as much, but day hikes and finding weird places in the woods had always drawn me in. The weirder and more abandoned, the better. My friends had been telling me about this mansion for over a year. A couple of them had gone multiple times. They said it was huge, tucked about 3 or 4 miles off a service road, and sat on what used to be some old private estate that no one had lived on in decades. They had shown me a few pictures at one point, mostly blurry cell phone shots of broken windows, collapsing furniture, weird graffiti. But the one that stuck in my mind was the picture of the long gravel driveway. It looked like something out of a dream, the kind where everything is just a little off. I didn't go the first few times they invited me. I was either busy or didn't feel like it, and honestly, I always assumed they were exaggerating. I thought it was probably just an old farmhouse or something, not the huge sprawling thing they kept hyping up. Eventually, they stopped asking, but the place stayed in my head. That picture of the driveway really did something to me. I kept thinking about it for months. That October, I finally made time to go. I didn't want to go with anyone else. I had this stupid idea that I wanted to write something about it, some kind of story or article. I wanted to really take it in without anyone around. So I planned out my route, packed light, and set off early in the morning. I parked near an old logging gate, way off the main road, and took a trail that looped through a long stretch of pine forest. I avoided the usual route people took because I didn't want to run into any campers or other hikers. I like to be alone on hikes like this, especially when I was going somewhere unusual. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a map printed off from an old website my friend had sent me. Most of the pages were grainy scans of survey maps with red lines drawn in Sharpie. I followed the directions closely, turning off onto an overgrown path after about 45 minutes of walking. It was mostly covered in dead leaves and pine needles, but I could still see the indentations in the earth where tires had once rolled. I followed it up a slow incline for another half hour until I came to the start of the driveway. Even after all the hype, the place still surprised me. The driveway was wide, maybe 15 feet across, covered in mossy gravel and flanked on both sides by tall, leaning pine trees. It curved gently to the left and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long moment just staring down it. There was a strange stillness in the air. No birds, no wind. The place just felt heavy. I followed the driveway around the bend, and then the mansion came into view. It was bigger than I expected. At least 4 stories tall, with a weird angular layout that didn't seem to follow any real logic. There were dozens of windows, some boarded up, some shattered. A large stone porch sat in front of the main entrance, and to the left, I saw a crumbling greenhouse attached to the house by what looked like a sunroom or enclosed walkway. The roof was partially caved in on one side, but the structure still stood solid for the most part. I walked up the steps slowly, taking in every detail. The door was wide open, hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was dry and stale. Dust and debris covered the floor. Every step echoed off the high ceilings. The first thing I noticed was the layout. The whole place felt off. The front room opened into a large hall with staircases on either side, but instead of going up in straight lines like you'd expect, they were tight spiral staircases with iron railings. One curved up to the left and the other to the right. The ceiling above me stretched up at least 3 stories, with crisscrossing beams and walkways that connected the upper levels in a zigzag pattern. It was like being inside a strange, oversized birdcage. I took the left staircase first, climbing slowly and keeping my hands on the cool iron rail. The metal creaked under my weight but held steady. At the top, I found myself in a wide hallway that twisted around the back of the house. Every corner I turned opened into a new corridor, and several times I looped back to the same spot without meaning to. The walls were painted in faded pastels, and there were built-in bookshelves everywhere, most of them empty but a few still filled with moldy books. The master bedroom was exactly where my friend said it would be, up another spiral staircase, just off the main entrance. The room was enormous. The carpet was moldy and torn, but I could see where furniture had once sat based on the faded outlines left behind. There was a walk-in closet the size of a small bedroom, a large bathroom with 2 sinks and a sunken tub, and a deck that overlooked what used to be a garden. Everything was overgrown and rotting. In the center of the bedroom, another spiral staircase led up to a small room I assumed was a study. I climbed up, the steps narrower and more precarious than the others, and found myself in a circular room with tall windows on every side. The view stretched out over the treetops, and I could see the driveway winding through the woods far below. There was an old elevator shaft in the corner, sealed shut with a metal gate. I pushed on it once and it didn't budge. Even if it had, I wouldn't have trusted it. The cable looked rusted through. I stayed up there for a while. The air was thinner, and I could feel the house shifting slightly in the wind. The floor creaked under my feet. I remember leaning against the window and just watching the trees for a while. Something about the whole place felt disconnected from the world outside, like it had been forgotten by time. After a while, I went back down and kept exploring. I took another hallway and ended up in what must have been a guest wing. More bedrooms, more spiral staircases, more strange layouts. One hallway curved around and led into a dead end with nothing but a fireplace set into the wall. I found a dumbwaiter in another room, but the pulley system had long since broken. Everything was silent, just my breathing and my footsteps. Eventually, I found a wide staircase going down. It was darker on that side of the house, and as I descended, the light from the windows grew dimmer. I found myself in a basement hallway, lined with doors. Some were open, revealing old storage rooms and broken furniture. Others were closed, swollen from moisture and hard to open. I managed to get a few open and found nothing but dust and mildew. At the end of the hall was another spiral staircase. This one led even deeper underground. I stood at the top and looked down. The light didn't reach the bottom. It just vanished into darkness. I took a step down, then another. I made it about 5 steps before I stopped. Something about it felt wrong. The air was colder, and the silence was different. Not just empty, but oppressive. Like sound couldn't exist down there. I felt a pressure in my chest. I stood there for a long time trying to convince myself to go further, but I couldn't do it. I turned around and went back up. I figured I had seen most of what there was to see. I was heading back to the main entrance when I saw something move outside the window, just a flicker of motion. A few seconds later, I heard tires crunching on gravel. I went to the window by the front door and looked out. There were 2 police cars in the driveway. I ducked back quickly. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't broken anything, hadn't taken anything, but I was definitely trespassing. I considered hiding, waiting until they left. But I knew that was risky. If they searched the house and found me, things would be worse. But still, I hesitated. I crept back from the window and sat behind the large staircase for a few minutes, trying to think. The longer I waited, the more nervous I got. Something about the idea of being found in that house, in one of those dark corners, made my skin crawl. Eventually, I stood up, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. The officers had just gotten out of their vehicles. I raised my hands and walked toward them slowly. They met me halfway, checked my ID, asked what I was doing there. They found my small pipe and grinder in my backpack but didn't seem too bothered by it. They told me not to come back, said the place was dangerous and unstable. One of them asked why I had gone in alone. I told him I was a writer looking for inspiration. He just shook his head and gave a half laugh. Told me he wouldn't have gone into that house unless someone paid him to. They let me go with a warning. I walked back the way I came, cutting through the woods and trying to process everything. The house stayed in my head for days after that. Every hallway, every spiral staircase, the feel of the air in that basement. I never went back. I thought about it, but I never made the trip. I lost the pictures I had taken somewhere along the way, probably on one of my old laptops. But that one image, the driveway leading up to the mansion, stayed with me. It's been over a decade now. The house might still be there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had finally collapsed or been torn down. Places like that don't last forever, but it stuck with me. The weirdness of the layout, the silence, the feeling that nothing in there made any sense. I never found out who built it or why it was abandoned. I tried looking into it once or twice, but there wasn't much to find. No records, no names. just another strange relic left to rot. I was 27 when I decided to hike the remote trails of the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. The region was known for its dense forests and rugged terrain, a place where few ventured alone. I had always been drawn to solitude, finding peace in the silence of nature. The trail started near a small village called Raznov. The locals were friendly but seemed wary when I mentioned my plans. An old man at the village store warned me about the unpredictable weather and the dangers of the forest. I thanked him but assured him I was prepared. The first day was uneventful. The trail was well marked and the weather was clear. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked a simple meal, and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. On the second day, the trail became less distinct. The forest grew denser, and the canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight. I relied on my map and compass to navigate, occasionally marking trees with chalk to ensure I could find my way back. It was around midday when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, unusual for such a remote area. I dismissed it, thinking it might be from a distant campfire. As I continued, the smell grew stronger. I slowed my pace, listening for any sounds that might indicate other people nearby. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I saw it, a small clearing with the remnants of a fire. Charred logs and ashes suggested it had been extinguished recently. There were no signs of tents or gear, just the fire pit. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been here and not long ago. I decided to move on, picking up my pace. The trail was becoming harder to follow, and I didn't want to be caught in the forest after dark. As the sun began to set, I found a suitable spot to camp. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the unease I felt. The forest was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I was awoken by a noise outside my tent, a twig snapping, followed by the rustle of leaves. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound stopped, and after a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. They were human and they circled my tent. Panic set in. Someone had been watching me. I packed up quickly and decided to cut my trip short. I needed to get back to the village, but as I tried to retrace my steps, I realized the chalk marks I had made on the trees were gone. Someone had erased them. I was lost. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt like a maze. I tried to stay calm, using my compass to head in the general direction of the village. But the dense underbrush and uneven terrain made progress slow. As night fell, I found a small rock outcropping to rest. I didn't dare set up my tent, opting instead to sleep under the stars, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The next day, I stumbled upon a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. After a few hours, I heard the sound of an engine. A beat-up truck appeared, driven by a middle-aged man. I waved him down and he stopped. I explained my situation, and he offered me a ride back to Raznov. Back in the village, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They took my statement but seemed skeptical. I didn't care. I was just glad to be safe. I never returned to the Carpathians. The experience left a lasting scar, a reminder that even the most serene places can harbor hidden dangers. It was 2009, and I was 24. I was broke, in between jobs, and trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. I'd just come off a couple months of couch hopping between friends in Oregon, and the only thing I owned was a beat-up old backpack, a second-hand sleeping bag, and a couple layers of clothing. I'd scraped together enough change to catch a bus down the coast and had hitchhiked the rest of the way into Northern California. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just south. That was the plan, south. I ended up somewhere near Mendocino County, just outside a tiny town I can't even remember the name of anymore. I'd wandered off the road late in the afternoon, looking for a place to crash for the night. The redwood forests up there are quiet and massive. I remember standing beneath some of those towering trees, their trunks thicker than any car I'd ever owned, feeling small but weirdly safe. The sun was dropping fast behind the canopy, and I knew I had maybe an hour before I'd be setting up in the dark. I found a small flat clearing not far from a barely there dirt path that split off from a logging road. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat and dry, and that's all I needed. I laid out the old wool blanket I carried around to soften the ground a bit. On top of that, I spread out my sleeping bag and wrapped myself in an extra blanket I kept folded in the bottom of my pack. I ate half a smashed granola bar I'd been carrying for a couple days and washed it down with lukewarm water from a bottle I'd refilled at a gas station that morning. Then I burrowed into the layers and tried to ignore how cold the air had gotten now that the sun was gone. I remember waking up sometime after midnight. The forest was pitch black and deathly silent. I wasn't scared, really, just awake. That kind of awake where your mind has no business being up but decides to be anyway. I fumbled for my little flashlight, one of those cheap plastic ones with a flickering bulb. When I clicked it on, I aimed it around absent-mindedly at first, just looking. That's when I noticed them. All around the edges of the blanket, every single edge, was a perfect line of long-legged, black spiders. They were big, not tarantula big, but definitely bigger than the usual house spider. Their legs looked thin but spindly, and they stood tall. All of them were facing outward, not one toward me. Each one was separated by just enough space that their legs didn't touch, but it looked almost like they'd been placed there deliberately, like a ring, a border. I stared at them for a long time, my mind struggling to wrap itself around the scene. I wasn't afraid at first, just confused. There was something surreal about it, almost like I wasn't fully awake. But I was. The cold in my toes told me I was. I swept the light across the perimeter again, slower this time. They didn't move, not a twitch, just stood there perfectly still, legs bent, bodies low. Eventually, I figured they must be waiting for something, maybe some kind of instinctual behavior, like lying in wait for bugs or prey to pass through. I didn't know a lot about spiders, but that made more sense than anything else. They weren't coming toward me. They weren't even looking in. So I pulled the blanket tighter around myself and slowly laid back down. I tried not to think about them, tried not to imagine them crawling over me in the dark. I kept the flashlight on for a while, aimed at the edge of the blanket, just watching. After a while, my eyes got too heavy, and I must have drifted off again. When I woke up the second time, it was morning. The sun had climbed high enough to filter through the trees, and the forest looked entirely different. Light, airy almost. That strange tension from the night had vanished. I sat up and looked around. The spiders were gone. Not a single one remained. No trace, no sign they'd ever been there. I even checked under the blanket edges, thinking maybe a few had crawled beneath, but there was nothing, just cold dirt and pine needles. I stood up, shook out the blankets, brushed myself off, and took a long drink of what little water I had left. I didn't feel scared, not exactly, but I felt something. It was like walking out of a dream that had gone just a little too deep. Something unsettling, something that lingered. I packed up slowly and made my way back to the dirt road. I walked most of the morning before catching a ride with a guy in a rusted pickup headed toward Fort Bragg. He asked if I was camping. I nodded but didn't say much else. Over the years, I've thought about that night more times than I can count. It wasn't a dream. I know what I saw. That ring of spiders, perfectly spaced, perfectly still. No one's ever given me a real explanation that made sense. Some people think I imagined it. Others say spiders group up sometimes, though I've never seen anything like that again. What sticks with me most isn't the fear or the weirdness of it. It's how deliberate it all looked. As if they had a purpose. Like they were guarding the edge. Not guarding me, not trapping me, just standing watch. Whatever it was, I never camped on the bare ground again. After that, I saved up for a tent, even if it was the cheapest one I could find. I still spent a lot of nights out in the woods during that phase of life, wandering and sleeping wherever I could. But I never saw that again. Nothing even close. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I still see that circle of spiders in my mind. Their long legs, their stillness, the way they faced outward. I still wonder what they were waiting for, and I still feel lucky that whatever it was, it never came. It was the summer of 2018, early July, when my wife and I took a long-awaited canoe camping trip up in northern Minnesota. We had both taken a week off work and planned a route through a chain of lakes that ran narrow and long through a stretch of old forest and scattered wetlands. The route was fairly quiet, a little off the more popular trails, which was perfect for us. We were looking to disconnect completely, to hear nothing but water, wind, and birds for a few days. After 2 days of paddling and portaging between lakes, we reached a narrow lake, probably no more than 50 or 60 meters across at its widest point. It stretched out in a curve, hugging the edge of a steep forested slope on one side and a low boggy area on the other. The shoreline on the bog side was thick with reeds and fallen trees, hard to land a canoe. The forested side had some rocky ledges that jutted out into the lake, and we picked a site halfway down, where there was a small flat clearing right above a rocky landing. It was a great little site, secluded with a good fire ring and just enough room for our tent, a tarp, and a couple of camp chairs. We spent the afternoon setting up, swimming, and collecting wood. The water was warm enough to swim, but cool enough to refresh you. The air was still and sticky, full of bugs but not unbearable, and the only sounds were loons and the distant splash of fish jumping. By the time we had dinner and cleaned up, the sun had dropped behind the tree line across the lake, and the sky was fading into that deep summer blue that comes just before night. Later, just before heading to bed, I walked down to the edge of the lake to wash my face and brush my teeth. I crouched near the water, using my hands to splash cool water onto my face. Felt good after a long, humid day. The lake surface was glassy, like a black mirror, and the reflection of the stars was starting to take shape in it. I stood up to dry off, and that's when I saw them. 2 little beams of light, maybe headlamps, on the other side of the lake. They were low to the ground and moving slowly through the trees. At first, I figured it was another pair of campers who had set up on the other side. But the movement of the lights didn't look like someone walking confidently through a familiar campsite. They moved with hesitation, jittery, like whoever was wearing them was unsure of their footing or their direction. I stood still, trying to make sense of it. The lights moved a little more, then one flickered and went out. A few seconds later, the other one dimmed and faded too. Now there was just darkness. That's when I heard it. A snorting sound, deep and sharp, then a heavy thump, like something big was shifting its weight. It sounded like it came from the same area where I had seen the lights. My first thought was moose. We had seen tracks on the portage trails the day before, and there were plenty of willows and aquatic plants along the boggy side of the lake. But it could have also been a black bear. They're not rare in this part of Minnesota. Whatever it was, it sounded big. Not just the size, but the presence it had in the dark. You could almost feel the way the sound carried across the still water. There wasn't a lick of wind, just the deep breathing and the occasional shuffle. I stood there for a while, trying to listen. Then I did something I don't usually do. I raised my voice and called out, asking if everything was okay. My voice echoed across the lake. I waited. Nothing at first, just the breathing. Then, from the dark edge of the trees, I heard movement again. Footsteps. They were stumbling through brush, not fast, but definitely trying to move. Eventually, I caught a glimpse of a figure, barely outlined by the stars and the last trace of dusk. Another figure followed. They were moving toward the water now. Turned out they were 2 young hikers, probably in their late 20s like us. I pieced the story together later from the way they were walking and from things they had with them. They had started their hike from the wrong trailhead, which added an extra hour or so to their route. Then, when they reached the lake, they took the trail that ran along the boggy side, probably thinking it was shorter. That trail wasn't marked well and definitely hadn't been maintained in years. From the look of them, they had been bushwhacking for quite a while, and their gear looked like it had taken a beating. I grabbed our spare flashlight, hopped in the canoe, and paddled across. The water was so still that every stroke echoed in the night. When I reached the other side, they were standing by a fallen tree near the edge of the water, trying to use a phone for light, but the battery was dead. I handed over the flashlight and motioned for them to get in the canoe. They didn't hesitate. As I paddled us back, I could hear one of them breathing heavily, almost panting, like they'd been pushing through fear for a while. The sound of whatever animal had been on their side had stopped. I didn't hear it again. Back at our campsite, they were polite and clearly relieved. I let them borrow the light while they set up their small tent a few meters away, in a small flat spot we had cleared earlier that day when we were thinking of making a second fire ring. They didn't have much to set up, just a simple backpacking tent and a couple of sleeping bags. It didn't take long. We didn't talk much. I went back to the tent and lay down next to my wife. I told her what had happened, and we both agreed it was lucky we were there. The idea of those two stumbling in the dark through the woods, with no light and no clue how far the next site was, gave me chills. If they had kept going along the wrong side of the lake, it would have been at least another 2 hours of rough trail, if you could even call it a trail, and by then they might have really gotten hurt. Twisted ankle, wrong turn, or worse, gotten too close to whatever was making those snorting noises. We slept light that night, not from fear but more from being alert. Every sound felt amplified in the dark. The hoot of an owl, the distant splash of something slipping into the water. Once or twice I thought I heard a stick crack near the edge of camp, but it never came closer. By morning, the sun cut through the mist hanging over the lake, and everything looked softer and smaller in the daylight. The two hikers were up early, packing up quickly. They thanked us silently with a wave and pushed off, heading back toward the correct trail. We watched them disappear around the bend of the lake. After they left, we sat by the water for a while, sipping our coffee. It was quiet again, peaceful, but I kept thinking about how close they had been to spending a night in the dark, with whatever was moving around over there. We never did find out what it was. Probably a moose, could have been a bear. Either way, it reminded me how easily things can go sideways in the woods, even with good gear and good intentions. That night stuck with me, not because anything terrible happened, but because something could have. We were just in the right place at the right time. A little bit of luck and a little bit of being prepared. The rest of the trip was quiet. We moved on to the next lake the following day and didn't see another person for 3 more days. The weather held, and we had a few more nights under the stars. But that one night, standing by the lake and watching those lights go out, hearing the breathing in the dark, it reminded me how thin the line is between a peaceful night and something else entirely. We finished the route 5 days later, sunburned, bug-bitten, and tired, but thankful. That trip became one of our favorites to remember, not because of the near miss, but because of how real it all felt. Just water, trees, and whatever else is out there, reminding you to stay humble and aware. The wilderness doesn't care if you make a mistake. It just keeps going. You either respect it or you pay the price. I still don't really like thinking about that trip, even though it's been almost 3 years now. Some nights I still have dreams about it. I'll be standing out in the open with nothing but trees and darkness around me, and there's this feeling that something is wrong. Something is watching, something close, but I can't ever see who or what it is. Then I wake up in a sweat. Every time. This happened in the summer of 2022. I was 27. Me and 7 of my closest friends had planned a long weekend of car camping out in Utah, south of a small town called Emory. We were way off the grid on Bureau of Land Management land, where you could camp for free as long as you followed the rules. No bathrooms, no picnic tables, no running water. Just dirt roads, junipers, brush, and mountains in the distance. I camped out there twice before. Both times had been quiet and peaceful, with the usual hassle of dust, sunburns, and bugs, but nothing bad. So when I suggested it as our destination for the long weekend, everyone was down. We had 3 cars total: my Subaru Outback, a friend's Tacoma, and another buddy's Grand Cherokee. Between the 8 of us, we had enough food, water, sleeping bags, and gear to make a pretty comfortable setup. The plan was to leave Friday morning, get to the site by afternoon, and stay until Monday. We had to drive about an hour and a half from the last paved road. down a winding Forest Service route with nothing but old cow fences and scrubland. It wasn't marked on Google Maps beyond the first half hour, but I had an offline GPS and had saved a couple of potential camp spots I'd found last time. We passed maybe one other vehicle during the whole drive-in, and that was early on. After that, it was like the world had emptied out behind us. We were really alone. That first evening was beautiful, warm and dry, a slight breeze coming off the distant plateaus, and skies so clear you could see the moonrise even before it was fully dark. We set up our tents, built a fire pit out of rocks, and started prepping dinner. Pasta and grilled sausage, plus some premixed drinks in coolers. It was the usual scene. Music playing off a Bluetooth speaker, people laughing, everyone easing into the trip. We weren't parked right next to the fire or tents. We'd parked the cars maybe 30 yards off, in a flat open stretch of dirt, so we wouldn't have to worry about waking up to a flat tent from uneven ground. From the cars, you could see for miles in every direction. That's part of what made this whole thing feel so insane. If anyone had come near our site on foot or by vehicle, we'd have noticed. There were no hills or thick woods to hide in, just low brush and open dirt. You could hear a vehicle coming long before you could see it. That's how empty it was. Anyway, dinner wrapped up around 9 p.m. It was starting to get properly dark, so people started gathering their stuff from the cars, extra jackets, flashlights, phone chargers. I was walking up to my car with one of the other guys when I heard someone say something about a flat tire. Not urgent, just surprised. We all kind of turned in that direction. One tire being low or going flat on these kinds of roads wasn't that unusual, so nobody panicked. But then someone checked the second car. Same tire, front right, completely flat. No signs of a slow leak or road damage, just flat. That's when people got quiet. I went over to my Subaru. Same thing, front right tire, flat. Clean slice on the sidewall, like it had been cut with something sharp. That's when the first wave of unease hit me. I got down on my knees, ran my fingers over the rubber. The cut wasn't jagged like a puncture from a rock. It was smooth, precise, same exact spot as the others. Nobody was talking much at this point. We were all just standing around the cars, flashlights casting these long shadows across the ground. I remember the air felt colder all of a sudden, even though it hadn't dropped that much in temperature. It was a different kind of cold, nervous, creeping cold. One of the guys had a pistol in his truck. He got it out and kept it on his hip from that moment forward. I remember him scanning the horizon like he expected someone to be out there watching us. And honestly, that was the worst part. The idea that someone had walked into our site, passed all of us, slashed 3 tires in total silence, and walked away again without leaving a trace. Or maybe they hadn't left. We argued for a few minutes about whether this could have been some kind of prank, but it didn't make sense. We were all together around the fire for the last few hours. Nobody had wandered off, and this wasn't the kind of group that played those kinds of games. These were people I trusted, people I'd known for years, and nobody had left our site, not once, since we got there. We also knew the tires didn't go flat while we were driving. They'd held up through an hour and a half of gravel and washboard roads. No way all 3 tires gave out the moment we parked. Once the initial shock wore off, we snapped into action. We all had spares, thank God, but we still had to replace all 3 in the dark, in the dirt, with nerves shot to hell. The guy with the gun stood guard while the rest of us got to work. We kept the headlights pointed outward. Nobody wanted to be the one with their back to the open land. It took maybe 45 minutes to swap out the tires. Fastest I've ever seen people change wheels. Nobody said much. We were focused. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the lug nut started. Every time the wind picked up or a branch cracked somewhere in the brush, I flinched. As soon as the last spare was on, we didn't even bother packing up the rest of our stuff. We left tents, chairs, food bins, everything. Just threw a few essentials into the trunks, got in the cars, and drove. No discussion, no looking back, just headlights sweeping through the dust, 3 sets of tires bouncing down the washboard road, every eye staring ahead. We didn't stop until we hit the first bit of cell service. That was about 45 miles later, when we reached the outskirts of a town called Castledale. It was just after midnight, We pulled into a gas station, one of those 24-hour truck stops, and sat there in silence for a while. Nobody really wanted to talk about it. I think we were all still trying to convince ourselves it hadn't been as bad as it felt. Like maybe it was a weird coincidence, or maybe we were just spooked because of the isolation. But deep down, I think we all knew the truth. Somebody had done that, on purpose. They'd come into our sight, waited until we were distracted, and disabled our cars in a way that could have stranded us completely. They could have done worse. If we hadn't had spares, or if we hadn't noticed until the morning, we'd have been stuck. No cell service, no help, and whoever did that could have come back. We called the local sheriff's office from the gas station, gave them our coordinates, told them which forest road we'd been on. They took the report, said they'd pass it on to the local rangers. There wasn't much they could do after the fact. They asked if anyone had been hurt, told us we'd done the right thing by leaving. That was it. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We got rooms at a cheap roadside motel and kept the lights on. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. I don't think I've ever felt more vulnerable. Over the next few days, we texted about it a lot. Everyone had theories. Maybe it was some crazy local who didn't want people camping out there. Maybe it was someone living off-grid trying to scare us off. But none of it made sense. Who would drive or hike that deep into BLM land just to slash some tires and disappear? Why only the front right tires? Why not take something or leave a message? What scared me the most was the thought that whoever did it had probably been watching us for hours. They would have seen us laughing, cooking, drinking, known we were distracted, known we had no idea they were there. I've gone camping since, but never that deep again. Now I stick to places with people nearby. I don't camp without service. I keep my car closer. I don't sleep as well out there anymore. That kind of trust in the wild, in the idea that you're alone and safe, it's gone. I still see that moment in my head sometimes. Flashlight beam catching the clean slice in the rubber. The way everyone froze. The silence that came over the group. It was like something had reached into our night and just twisted it. Left something wrong at the edge of our firelight. We got lucky. That's the only way I can explain it. We got out because we had spares and because one guy had the sense to be armed. If we'd stayed the night, I honestly don't know what might have happened. I try not to think too hard about it, but that question never really goes away. Even now, years later, I double-check every tire before I go to bed in the backcountry. I park facing out. I keep a flashlight and knife in my sleeping bag. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the night goes still, I find myself holding my breath and listening, just in case someone's out there watching again. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 23 at the time. I had just wrapped up my junior year at a small college in Southern Oregon. Most of my weekends were spent outside, climbing, hiking, camping, or doing a mix of all three with a small group of friends who were into bouldering as much as I was. There was a particular stretch of national forest a little over 2 hours away from where I lived, just past a rural town called Kellerton. That place was kind of our spot. Not many people knew about it, which was surprising because it had everything. Massive granite boulders, overhanging rock faces, pine-covered trails, and plenty of clearings to set up camp for the night. Our crew was usually 4 of us, me, Chris, Jay, and Naomi. Sometimes others came along, but we were the consistent ones. We made a habit of going up there every few weekends during the warmer months, usually driving up Friday afternoon, climbing Saturday, camping that night, and heading back late Sunday. It saved time and gas, and we loved being out there, away from the noise. This story happened the 4th time we camped out there. By that point, we already had a rhythm to everything. We'd park in the same spot off a dirt road just outside the tree line, carry our gear up the trail for about 20 minutes, and set up camp in a relatively flat clearing not far from a cluster of boulders we called the Cradle. The name came from the way the rocks surrounded the area like protective arms. Felt safe, familiar. That trip started like any other. We set up camp, climbed a few problems before sunset, and settled in for the night. Naomi had a bad habit of leaving her gear outside her tent. Her climbing shoes, her rucksack, even snacks sometimes. We told her to be careful about it because of animals, but she always shrugged it off. That night, she did the same. The next morning, her boots were gone. along with one of her jackets, a bag of chalk powder, and a pair of sweatpants. At first, we thought she was just disorganized again. She swore up and down that she'd left her stuff right outside the tent flap, but none of us remembered seeing it before we went to bed. We looked around the area, even hiked back to the cradle and retraced our steps, thinking she might have set it down somewhere and forgotten. Nothing, not a trace. The weirdest part was how selective the disappearance was. Only her gear, nothing from the rest of us. No sign of animals dragging stuff away, no footprints or markings, just gone. We told ourselves maybe she had left it near the boulders and an animal carried it off. Maybe a raccoon or coyote got into her bag. It sounded weak even at the time, but we didn't want to believe that someone else was out there with us. The whole point of going that deep into the forest was to be alone. That was the last night of that trip, and the rest of the summer went by without much incident. The following year, around the same time in early August, we went back. This time it was just me, Chris, and Naomi. Jay had sprained his wrist a week prior, so he sat the trip out. We arrived around mid-afternoon, same as always, parked the car off the side of the dirt road, made the hike in, and set up camp near the cradle. Felt like nothing had changed. Same quiet woods, same trees, same open sky above the clearing. We didn't bring up the missing gear from last year. No one wanted to start the trip off on a weird note. We climbed for most of the day, took a break for lunch, then did some late afternoon routes before calling it around dusk. We ate near the fire pit we always built up with stones. After dinner, we just sat there for a while, talking, laughing, staring at the fire. It got dark fast, and the only light came from the fire, which cast these long, dancing shadows across the trees. I remember feeling this weird sort of comfort and tension at the same time, like I was completely relaxed, but still hyper-aware of every crackle in the woods around us. I got up to take a leak. Didn't go far, just past the trees to where I wouldn't be seen. I remember looking down at my feet, watching where I stepped so I wouldn't trip. Then I glanced up and froze. About 20 or 30 feet ahead, half covered in fallen branches and thick undergrowth, someone was lying on their stomach. Not just lying there, watching, staring straight toward our camp. The only reason I saw them was because of the light from our fire bouncing off what looked like a small, curved piece of glass near their head. Probably something on their gear. My eyes adjusted more, and I could make out a full ghillie suit. The shape of the body was unmistakable. Elbows bent, head propped slightly upward, lying in the brush like they'd been there for a while. I didn't move. My brain kind of short-circuited for a second. I wasn't sure if I was seeing what I thought I was. Then he moved. Just a twitch of the head, like he realized I'd seen him, and then he bolted. I mean fast. No hesitation. Just jumped up and ran through the trees. I lost sight of him almost immediately. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, heart hammering in my chest. I walked back to the camp slowly, trying to act normal. I didn't want to scare Naomi or Chris, and I didn't want to admit to myself what I'd seen just yet. I didn't sleep that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me jerk awake. I stared into the trees, waiting for movement. Nothing happened, but I felt watched the entire time. Naomi said she felt off too, though she didn't say much more. Chris seemed fine, snoring most of the night. We left at sunrise. Didn't even eat breakfast. Just packed up and got out. On the hike back, I kept scanning the treeline. I didn't tell them what I saw until we were back at the car, and even then, I played it down. Said it might have just been a hunter, but a hunter lying on his stomach, in a full ghillie suit, watching our camp in the dead of night? It didn't sit right. When we got home, I tried to report it. I called the forest ranger's office for that region and told them we thought we might have seen someone watching us. They made a note of it, but they didn't sound concerned. Said sometimes people camp out in random places and it's not unusual. I didn't push it. We never went back after that. Every time we talked about planning another trip, someone made an excuse. Too busy, too far, weather looked bad. I think we all knew we weren't going back. That place didn't feel safe anymore. I still think about that guy, especially when I'm out hiking alone. Who was he? Why was he lying there, watching? And did he have anything to do with Naomi's gear going missing the year before? We'll never know. It's all just guesses and gut feelings. But whatever his reason was, I know what I saw. And I know he didn't expect to be seen. I haven't camped deep in the woods since then. I still hike, still boulder sometimes, but I stick to more popular trails now. Places with other people around. I miss the quiet, the isolation of those trips, but after that night, I can't enjoy it the same way, because someone out there was watching us, and they had been close, way too close. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip out to a quiet, remote section of Sleeping Giant Provincial Park in Ontario. I was 34 then, working as a freelance writer, and I needed a break. I'd spent the last few months buried in deadlines, surrounded by city noise, and I was desperate to reset. A solo trip out into the Canadian wilderness seemed like exactly what I needed. I'd always been drawn to solitude, and hiking helped me think clearly, especially when I was completely alone in nature. I'd chosen a less trafficked section of the park, a trail that looped close to the edge of the peninsula, near the shore of Lake Superior. The park was huge, and I knew that this particular area didn't see much foot traffic. It was early in the season, too, mid-June, so there weren't many people out yet. Most campers stuck to the more popular sites, but I wanted something quiet and remote. I parked my car in the designated lot, loaded up my backpack, and began the hike in around noon. The first few hours on the trail were perfect. The weather was cool and clear, with only a light breeze pushing through the tall spruce trees. I hiked slowly, pacing myself, taking in the surroundings, the smell of pine needles and damp soil, the distant call of birds echoing between the trees, the crunch of my boots on the packed dirt trail. I passed a few creeks, crossed a couple small wooden bridges, and saw a hare dart off into the brush when I startled it. The silence was so deep it felt like it wrapped around me. I reached my intended campsite in the late afternoon. It was a flat spot just off the main trail, a few yards back from a steep slope that led down to a narrow pebble beach along the lake. There was a decent clearing in the trees with enough space for my small tent and a safe spot for a campfire. I dropped my pack and stood there for a moment, just listening. The wind coming off the water brought a soft rustling through the trees, and I could hear the small waves slapping at the stones below. Setting up camp didn't take long. I'd done it dozens of times before. Tent up, stakes in, gear inside, food hung up away from the site. After that, I gathered some firewood and got a small fire going, just enough for warmth and a bit of light. I heated up a can of soup, ate while sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the slope, and watched the sun start to sink toward the horizon. The view out over the lake was beautiful, just water and sky and a soft haze hanging over everything. As the light faded, I started to feel that familiar unease that always came with the first night alone in the woods. I've done enough solo trips to know that it usually takes me a day or two to adjust. The woods get loud at night. Every little creak and groan in the trees, every distant rustle, every crack of a twig underfoot somewhere out there. It all jumps out at you when you're by yourself with no distractions. I know it's just animals, wind, maybe the sound of branches falling, but my brain doesn't always cooperate. After putting out the fire completely and making sure everything was tucked away safely, I crawled into my tent. I laid back on my sleeping pad and tried to relax. I read for a little while with my headlamp on, but my eyes kept drifting toward the dark corners of the tent. Outside, the forest was wide awake. I could hear insects chirping in waves, something moving through the brush, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I kept reminding myself this was normal. This was how the woods sounded. But that night, it was harder to settle down. Maybe because I was tired but not quite exhausted. Maybe because I hadn't seen another person all day. Whatever it was, my thoughts kept drifting in the wrong direction. I started thinking about all the horror stories I'd read. Not the supernatural kind, the real kind. Stories about people going missing in the woods, people being stalked, campers found weeks later. I know most of it is rare, but when you're alone and the only light is your headlamp and the moon, logic doesn't help much. At one point, I turned off my headlamp and tried to just let the sounds become background noise. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. But then I heard something that didn't sound like small wildlife. It was heavier, a deep, crunching step on dried leaves and twigs. Not rapid, but not slow either. A few steps, then a pause. Then another crack of a branch. My heart started thudding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I laid completely still. My ears were wide open, trying to catch every sound. The steps weren't coming closer, not right away, but they didn't move away either. It was hard to tell exactly where they were. Maybe just off to the right of my tent, closer to the slope. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe even a moose, but it didn't sound like something walking casually. It sounded like something trying to be careful but failing at it. Then came a sudden crash, something big and heavy moving fast. I heard rocks shifting and the high-pitched sound of them clattering down the slope to the beach. It wasn't a person. It was too loud, too much weight behind it. Something had definitely fallen. I sat up quickly, fumbling for my flashlight. My hands were shaking a bit as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the tent wall, lighting up the orange fabric, but I couldn't see anything outside yet. I unzipped the door slowly, holding my breath. I leaned forward and pushed the flap aside. What I saw in the beam of light made my whole body go still. Down on the beach, just a few feet below where the slope leveled out, there was a large elk. It was awkwardly scrambling to its feet on the pebbles, clearly shaken. Its hind legs slipped on the rocks as it tried to get its footing. It stood there for a few seconds, breathing hard, sides heaving, before it turned and took off into the woods, crashing through the underbrush on the other side of the slope. I just sat there, half inside the tent, my flashlight beam flicking around, waiting for my heart to slow down. It was just an elk, a clumsy, unlucky elk that had wandered too close to the edge and taken a fall. But in the moment before I saw it, I'd been so sure it was something else, something worse. The fear hadn't felt like a maybe, it had felt real and certain. I checked the area around my camp, gave the woods a few more sweeps with the flashlight, and then went back into the tent. I zipped it up, turned off the light, and laid back down, still wide awake. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. The woods didn't quiet down. If anything, they felt louder after the crash. But eventually, sometime after midnight, I fell asleep. The next morning, the sky was pale and cloudy, the kind of gray that diffuses the sun and softens everything. I stepped outside and walked down the slope carefully, checking out the area where the elk had fallen. There were deep gouges in the earth where its hooves had kicked, and a small section of pebbles had been disturbed. Nothing else. No sign of injury. No blood. It must have gotten off with just a scare. I packed up camp a little slower than usual that morning, made coffee, sat by the edge of the slope with my mug, and watched the lake for a while. I thought about heading back early, maybe cutting the trip short, but I didn't. Once the light came back, so did my rational mind. The woods felt less threatening in daylight, and I reminded myself that fear like that is part of the package when you choose to be alone in the middle of nowhere. The rest of the trip went without incident. I hiked deeper into the park, found another campsite further inland for the second night, and by then I'd settled into the rhythm of it. The fear didn't return the same way, but that first night stayed with me. The sound of those footsteps, the crash, the seconds of imagining the worst, that part was burned into my memory. I think it always will be. It was a good reminder that being out there alone means you hear everything, that your mind can spin stories faster than anything else in the woods, and that sometimes it really is just an elk falling down a hill, but you still have to go through the fear to find that out. I've gone back to Sleeping Giant since then. I even stayed at the same site a year later, just to prove to myself that I could. It was still loud, still remote, but it felt different knowing what had happened. It wasn't a story I ever told anyone until now, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't unbelievable. It was just one of those nights where the line between real danger and imagined danger gets blurry, and you realize how thin that line can be when you're truly alone.